I still lead search crews into the Kettleback Range every fall, but I changed one rule after the Calder search, and I have never gone back on it. Nobody on my team hikes in a fixed rhythm anymore. Not on the radio, not on the trail, not even tapping a boot against a rock while we wait for a helicopter. I made Callum practice breaking his own stride on flat ground before I would take him back out that winter, and he still does it. Even now, even on trails that have nothing wrong with them at all. People who don't know why think it's a strange habit for a search and rescue volunteer to have. I let them think that. It's easier than the alternative. Wyatt Calder walked out of the Antler Fork drainage on the 9th day after we lost radio contact with him, and by every measure we had, he shouldn't have been able to. He had lost 11 pounds, and he had a stress fracture in his left tibia that should have put him on the ground 3 days before we found him. He had no food left, no working light source, and a water filter that had cracked somewhere in the first 48 hours. And he walked out anyway, upright, on his own legs, following a compass bearing that took him almost directly to the trailhead through terrain he had no way of navigating blind. The state trooper who interviewed him first wrote in his report that Wyatt kept referring to the other one as though it were a fact everyone already understood. Wyatt wasn't confused when he said it. That's the part that stayed with me longer than anything else from that week. He wasn't rambling, and he wasn't in shock the way people usually are when we bring them out. He was precise. He counted his own steps out loud while the paramedics worked on his leg, stopped exactly on a number, and told them that was as far as he was allowed to go without checking in. Before I get into what we found in that drainage and what we found afterward in files that had nothing to do with Wyatt Calder at all, I want to ask you to do 2 things. Hit the like button if you're the kind of person who reads trail reports for fun, because that's basically what the next while is going to be. And subscribe, because I've got 2 more incident files from our region that I still can't fully explain, and I'll be telling those eventually too. If you know someone who still hikes alone at dusk because they think nothing could possibly be following a fixed strider like them, send this one their way. They should hear this before they do that again. My name is Mara Voss. I'm a physical therapist assistant by trade, which is a duller job than it sounds, mostly knee replacements and rotator cuff patients working through range of motion exercises in a strip mall clinic. I've been a volunteer with the Kettleback County Search and Rescue Team for 9 years, and I'm also a certified wilderness EMT, which around here means I'm one of maybe 6 people qualified to make field decisions about whether an injury needs a helicopter or just a very long, very unpleasant carryout. I mention the credentials not to impress anyone, but because you need to understand that when I tell you a set of tracks didn't make sense, I've spent almost a decade reading tracks that did. I live alone in a small rental house on the east side of Coulter's Notch, close enough to the clinic that I can walk to work on the mornings I'm not too sore from a training hike the day before, and my life outside of SAR work has always been fairly quiet by design. I dated someone seriously for about 3 years before the Calder search, a contractor named Iggy, who did custom cabinetry out of a shop 2 towns over. And part of what ended that relationship, if I'm being fully honest, was the amount of my time and attention search work has always demanded. Entire weekends gone on a moment's notice. Entire nights spent staring at topo maps instead of at him. He wasn't wrong to want more of me than the job ever left over. I've never fully regretted the choice I kept making anyway. I bring that up only because I think it matters later that I went into that drainage the second time, essentially alone in every sense of the word that counts. No partner waiting up worried, no family checking in nightly, nobody but Dean and Callum who would have noticed immediately if something had gone wrong and I hadn't come back. I don't say that for sympathy. I say it because it's part of why I felt free enough to go back a 3rd time, alone, 14 months later, in a way I might not have felt free to do if there had been someone at home whose worry I would have had to weigh against my own need to know. The Kettleback Range isn't famous. It doesn't have a national park attached to it. And most of the people who hike there are locals, or serious backcountry types who found it through word of mouth rather than a magazine list. It's steep, heavily timbered lower down, and it drains through a series of narrow creek systems that all eventually feed into the Antler Fork. Before the Antler Fork itself drops into a box canyon we call the Sable Bowl. The bowl isn't on most trail maps as a destination, because it isn't one. It's a dead end ringed by cliff on 3 sides, full of old silver mining shafts from the 1890s that were never properly sealed, and the Forest Service discourages travel past the last established camp because of exactly that. There's a sign. It doesn't stop everybody. The mining history back there is real, at least verifiable in county records if you go looking, which I eventually did. A small silver strike brought maybe 200 people into that basin for a little over a decade starting in 1887, enough to justify a narrow-gauge tramline that's long since collapsed into the timber, enough to sink at least 11 separate shafts into the canyon walls before the vein played out, and the whole operation folded almost as fast as it had started. Most of those shaft entrances have since slumped shut on their own. Decades of freeze and thaw, doing what the mining company never bothered to do properly before they pulled out. But a handful are still open enough to swallow a careless boot. Black, cold openings in the rock that the Forest Service flags on its internal maps, but doesn't bother marking individually on the ground, because the whole basin is already closed to casual travel, and a dozen small warning signs would do more to attract curious hikers than deter them. I've stood at the mouth of one of those shafts exactly once, years before any of this happened, on an early training hike with Dean, and I remember him telling me in the same flat, practical tone he uses for everything, that the air coming up out of it was noticeably colder than the air around it, and that he'd never once gone in past the point where daylight still reached the floor, and never would. Wyatt Calder was 34, a freelance landscape photographer who came through Coulter's Notch twice a year to shoot the larch turning color in the high basins. He wasn't a novice. He had a satellite messenger, he'd filed a trip plan with the ranger station, and he knew enough to avoid the bowl on his stated route. His plan had him doing a 6-day loop up Antler Fork, over Talus Saddle, and back down through Corbin Creek, camping at 3 specific, legal, established sites. He checked in on schedule for the first 3 days. Then, he didn't check in on day 4, and by the time his emergency contact called it in on the morning of day 5, we had already lost almost 24 hours we didn't get back. I want to be precise about the timeline here, because the order of things matters more than it seems like it should right now. Day 1 and 2, nothing unusual. His messenger pings tracked cleanly along his stated route, evenly spaced. The kind of data that tells you a hiker is moving at a normal, healthy pace and taking normal, healthy breaks. Day 3, the pings start clustering strangely around a section of trail just below Talus Saddle, near a creek crossing we call the Second Ford, which is nothing more than a wide gravel bar where Antler Fork briefly splits around a stand of alder. Day 4, the pings stop entirely. His messenger battery, based on the model, should have had another 4 to 5 days of life left in it. Dean Prater has run our SAR chapter for 22 years, longer than I've been alive as a functioning adult, and he's the one who assigned me to the hasty team that first went in after Wyatt. Dean is not a warm man. He's efficient, he's exact, and he doesn't waste words on people who haven't earned them yet, which took me about 4 years to earn. He's also the only person on our team who was active during an earlier incident that I didn't know much about at the time, one involving a hiker named Renee Okafor, who went missing in almost the same drainage 6 years before Wyatt Calder ever set foot in the Kettlebacks. I bring up Renee now because you'll need her later. I promise I'm not forgetting her. I should tell you the rest of what Renee Okafor was to me, because it explains a few decisions I made later that wouldn't otherwise make much sense. She taught 10th grade biology at Coulter's Notch High School back when I was 16, and had no idea yet that I'd end up spending my adult life doing anything remotely medical. I fainted in her classroom once, hard, mid-lecture, a combination of low blood sugar and a growth spurt my body hadn't fully caught up with yet. And Renee was the one who got me on my side, kept my airway clear, timed how long I was out, and gave the paramedics who arrived a clean, precise account of everything that had happened before they'd even gotten their bag off their shoulder. She told me afterward, almost offhand, that I'd done fine, that fainting wasn't something to be embarrassed about, and that if I ever wanted to learn how to be the person doing what she'd just done instead of the person on the floor, she knew a program at the community college that took applications starting at 18. I took her advice, eventually, a few years later than she probably meant for me to. By the time I actually enrolled in that EMT program, Renee had already been missing for almost a year, one of the last searches Dean had run before I ever joined the team myself. I never got to tell her that she was the reason I'd chosen the path I chose. I've thought about that a lot over the years, the specific, quiet ache of owing someone a debt you can never actually deliver. And I think it's part of why, when Dean first said her name to me at that meadow campsite, something in my chest went very still in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with an old, unfinished conversation I'd never gotten the chance to have. The hasty team going in for Wyatt was me, Dean, and a newer volunteer named Callum Reyes, 27, an ER tech at the regional hospital, who'd only been certified with us for about 8 months. Callum was eager in the way new volunteers usually are, which is to say occasionally more useful than he gave himself credit for, and occasionally a genuine liability. The kind of guy who wants to prove himself so badly that he forgets the point of the job is not proving anything at all. I liked him. I still like him, even after everything, maybe especially after everything, because of how he handled the last hour of what I'm about to describe. But going in, he was green, and Dean and I both knew it, and we planned around it the way you plan around weather. We started at the Antler Fork trailhead a little after 6 in the morning, in cold enough air that our breath hung visibly ahead of us for the first hour of the hike, and I remember being grateful for that, because breath is one of the easiest things to track a person by in early morning cold, if you know what you're looking at. Dean took point. He's 61, but he moves through that terrain like he grew up in it, which he more or less did. I fell in behind him at a pace I've used for years, an old habit from my PT training more than anything else. I count my steps in blocks of 100 between landmarks, partly to gauge distance on unmarked terrain, partly because counting keeps my mind from spiraling during a call-out, which is a job hazard nobody warns you about when you sign up for search and rescue. You spend a lot of hours walking toward the possibility of finding someone dead. Counting helps. I'm telling you about the counting because it becomes important later, and I'd rather flag it now than have you feel like I pulled something out of nowhere at the end. The first 4 miles were uneventful in every sense of the word. We passed the site of Wyatt's second established camp, found his fire ring cold but recently used, his tent stake holes still crisp in the dirt. No sign of struggle, no sign of animal activity beyond the normal squirrel disturbance you'd expect around any site that had food stored in it at some point. Dean logged the site, we photographed the boot prints leading out of it, and we moved on toward the second ford, the last place his messenger had pinged before it went silent. The trail down to the second ford runs through about half a mile of old-growth cedar, dense enough that the light changes color when you walk into it. Greener, dimmer, the kind of shift that makes your eyes work a little harder without you consciously noticing why. It's usually loud in there. Squirrels, jays, the creek itself running high enough in early fall to be audible from 50 yards off. I want you to hold on to that detail, The noise, because it matters in about 10 minutes of trail time, and I didn't understand how much it mattered until we were most of the way out. Dean's search dog wasn't with us that first morning. Our K9 handler, a woman named Priya Aldrich, was running her dog Birch on a separate approach up Corbin Creek in case Wyatt had reversed course. So it wasn't until the second day that Birch worked the second ford directly, and I'll get to that. On day one, it was just the three of us, and what we found at the ford itself was Wyatt's last confirmed location and almost nothing else useful. His messenger, we later learned from the manufacturer's data logs, had sent its final scheduled ping from a spot about 30 feet upstream of the gravel bar, in a small clearing, where the alder breaks and you get a clean view up toward Talus Saddle. After that, silence. We found one of his trekking poles wedged upright in the gravel about 6 feet from where the messenger last pinged, which is the kind of detail that means very little on its own. People drop poles. People set them down to filter water or take a photograph and forget them in the panic of realizing they're losing daylight. Dean didn't comment on it beyond logging the GPS coordinate. I didn't comment on it either, not out loud, though something about the angle of it bothered me in a way I couldn't articulate at the time. It wasn't leaning against anything. It was standing, planted straight down into the gravel like someone had set it there deliberately, the way you'd stake a tent line, not the way you'd drop something while stumbling. We worked the area for 2 more hours, widening our search radius in the standard grid pattern, calling Wyatt's name at intervals, checking the creek for any sign he'd gone in the water. Nothing. No blood, no torn clothing caught on brush, no sign of a fall. The trail itself continued clearly up toward the saddle, marked in the dirt by a boot tread that matched the photographs his emergency contact had sent us of his hiking shoes, a fairly distinctive lug pattern from a brand that isn't common in our area. Dean found where the tread picked back up on the far side of the ford, continuing on the correct route toward the saddle, evenly spaced, unhurried. Whatever had happened to Wyatt Calder, it hadn't happened at the second ford. He had crossed it and kept walking, apparently calm, apparently fine. That should have been reassuring. In a strange way, it wasn't. And I think that's because a missing person case with no drama in it is somehow worse than one with an obvious point of failure. A twisted ankle at a stream crossing, a slip on wet rock, those are things we understand. A hiker who crosses a ford without incident and simply, silently, stops transmitting is a puzzle with no shape yet. And puzzles with no shape are the ones that keep search coordinators up at night, running scenarios that don't resolve. We camped that night about a mile below Talus Saddle, in a flat clearing we use as a staging site whenever operations run multi-day, and Dean got on the radio with base to arrange for Priya and Birch to come up and work the ford in the morning, along with a second team that would push further up toward the saddle and beyond, into terrain that started edging closer to the Sable Bowl boundary than any of us liked to think about yet. It was during that radio call that I heard it the first time, though I didn't understand what I was hearing until much later. Dean keyed up to relay coordinates to base, standard traffic, nothing unusual in the content, just numbers and a grid reference, but underneath his voice, faint, almost like an echo, but not quite matching the timing of an echo, I heard what sounded like the same numbers being read back a half second behind him, in a voice that was close to Dean's, but not quite his pitch. I actually looked at Dean while he was talking, confused, because for a second, I thought maybe there was some kind of relay delay on the repeater, radio traffic looping back on itself the way it sometimes does in mountainous terrain with a lot of reflective rock. Dean didn't react. Base didn't mention it. I chalked it up to exhaustion and bad acoustics and didn't say anything, mostly because I didn't have anything coherent to say. It's hard to report. I think I heard an echo that wasn't quite an echo to a room full of people who are trying to find a missing man. I want to be honest that at the time I filed it away and moved on. You have to, in this work, If you stop to interrogate every strange sound in the backcountry, you'd never get anything done. Radios do strange things in canyon country. Voices carry oddly off rock faces. I told myself some version of that and went to sleep. Priya and Birch reached the second ford a little after 8 the next morning, and this is where things stopped being explainable by acoustics or exhaustion. Birch is a 12-year-old Belgian Malinois with almost 200 confirmed finds over his career. A dog who has worked avalanche debris, flood wreckage, and one particularly bad structural collapse 3 counties over without so much as a hesitation in his gait. Priya has handled him since he was 14 months old. She knows every register of his behavior the way you know a close friend's moods from across a room. When she brought him down to the gravel bar at the second ford and gave him the scent article, one of Wyatt's worn socks from his vehicle, Birch worked the near bank confidently, tail up, nose down, exactly the way he's trained to. He crossed to the far side without any trouble and picked up what was clearly Wyatt's trail continuing toward the saddle. Then Priya tried to bring him back across for a second pass, to double-check the near side clearing where the trekking pole had been standing upright in the gravel. And Birch stopped at the water's edge and would not go in. Not hesitant, not distracted by a squirrel or a scent competing for his attention. He planted all 4 feet at the edge of the gravel bar, lowered his head, and would not move forward no matter what Priya did. And Priya has told me since that in 11 years of working that dog, she had never once seen him refuse a direct command with that particular posture. The stiff-legged, ears-back stance you see in dogs bracing against something they perceive as a real and immediate threat. Not fear of water. Birch swims. He'll cross rivers twice that width without a second thought when the job calls for it. This was different, and Priya knew it was different, and she radioed it in exactly as she saw it rather than trying to explain it away, which I've always respected about her. Priya described his ears in that moment as pinned, flat, and slightly back, not the alert forward set he uses when he's caught a live scent trail, and his tail had dropped low and tucked. A posture combination she'd only ever seen him produce twice before in his working life, both times in situations that later turned out to involve genuine, immediate physical danger to the team. A collapsing embankment once, and a startled black bear with cubs the other. She said that was the detail that convinced her to stop pushing him entirely, rather than write it off as an unusually stubborn morning. Birch doesn't do stubborn. In 11 years, she'd never once known him to refuse a command out of simple contrariness. Every refusal in his working history had meant something, and she trusted that history enough not to override it twice in the same morning. She tried 3 more times over the next 20 minutes, approaching from slightly different angles, and Birch refused every single attempt in the exact same spot. A stretch of gravel no more than 4 feet wide, roughly where the trekking pole had been planted the day before. He wasn't looking at anything specific when he refused. He wasn't barking or growling at a fixed point. He was simply refusing to enter that 4-foot stretch of ground, as though there were an invisible line drawn across the gravel bar that his training told him not to cross. Dean logged it. I logged it. None of us said much about it out loud that morning because there wasn't anything productive to say, but I noticed that when we broke camp to push on toward the saddle, all 3 of us gave that particular stretch of the ford a wider berth than the terrain strictly required, stepping around it rather than through it, without anybody suggesting we should. We reached Talus Saddle by early afternoon, and this is where we picked up the first piece of evidence that gave us real hope. A partial boot print in a patch of softer soil just below the saddle, clearly Wyatt's tread, angled correctly on his stated route toward Corbin Creek. Dean radioed base with an updated probable direction of travel, and for about 2 hours, the operation had the shape of a normal search again, methodical, hopeful, procedural. Then Callum, who had joined us at the saddle with the second team, found the trail camera. The camera wasn't ours. A local wildlife photographer named Otis Granger maintains a small network of trail cameras through that section of the Kettlebacks, mostly aimed at game trails for elk and the occasional wolverine sighting, and he'd given our team standing permission to pull footage from any of his units during an active search. Callum recognized the unit strapped to a hemlock about 80 yards below the saddle, checked the card, and found 6 days of triggered images, most of them the usual deer and one curious black bear that had investigated the housing itself. And then, time-stamped at 4:47 in the afternoon on day 3, the day the messenger pings had started clustering strangely near the ford, there was Wyatt. He looked fine in the photo. Tired, maybe, the particular slump of someone 4 days into a backcountry trip, but upright, moving at a normal pace, dressed exactly as his emergency contact had described, right down to the orange gaiters he wore to keep debris out of his boots. He was looking slightly to his left as he passed the camera's trigger zone, not alarmed, more like a person mid-conversation glancing at whoever they're walking with. The problem was that there was nobody else in the frame. Callum showed it to Dean first, and Dean did the thing he does when he's trying not to show a reaction, which is go very still and very quiet for slightly longer than the moment calls for. He asked Callum to pull the 2 frames on either side of it, the ones triggered a few seconds before and after, standard procedure to build a fuller picture of movement through the trigger zone. Otis's cameras trigger on motion with a roughly 2-second recovery window between shots, fast enough, under normal conditions, to catch a hiker's full stride sequence across the frame in 3 or 4 consecutive images if their pace is steady, and slow enough that anything moving unusually fast or unusually low to the ground tends to show up blurred or missing entirely between one trigger and the next, an artifact Otis himself had complained about more than once when he came by the station to drop off cards, usually blaming it on deer bolting through the frame faster than the sensor could resolve them cleanly. In the frame before, the trail is empty. In the frame after, Wyatt is fully in view, walking normally, still glancing to his left, and there's a motion blur at the very edge of the frame, low to the ground, that could have been anything. A branch swaying in wind the camera hadn't caught elsewhere in 6 days of footage. A trick of the shutter speed. Dean called it inconclusive, logged the timestamp and coordinates, and we moved on, because that's what you do. You log what can't be explained, and you keep working the case you can actually solve. I want to tell you that I let it go as easily as Dean seemed to. I didn't. I looked at that photograph a lot longer than I let on, and what stuck with me wasn't the blur at the edge of the frame. It was the angle of Wyatt's head, the specific tilt of someone listening to a person walking just slightly behind and to the side of them. A posture I recognized because I've walked next to hundreds of hikers on hundreds of trails, and I know what it looks like when someone is genuinely alone versus when someone is in the middle of a conversation. Wyatt Calder, in that photograph, did not look like a man alone. That was one anomaly I could still explain away if I worked at it hard enough. A trick of blur, a habit of talking to himself. Plenty of solo hikers do that, myself included, on long stretches when the silence gets to be too much. It's a mundane, ordinary thing. What happened at the next campsite was harder to explain away, and I want to walk you through it carefully, because this is where the pattern started to repeat itself in a way that stopped feeling like coincidence. Wyatt's third established campsite, per his trip plan, sat in a meadow about 2 miles past the saddle, a popular spot with a good water source, and enough flat ground for 4 or 5 tents. His messenger data showed no further pings after the second ford, so we had no confirmed evidence he'd ever reached this site, but it was directly on his stated route, so it made sense as our next search priority. We reached it a little before 6 in the evening on day 2 of the operation, losing light fast, cold coming down off the peaks in that particular way it does in early October, when summer is very clearly over, and nobody's told the calendar yet. There was no tent site disturbance in the meadow itself, no fire ring, nothing to suggest Wyatt had ever camped there. What there was, along the soft mud fringe where the meadow met the creek, was a set of boot prints. 2 sets actually, overlapping, running parallel, moving in the same direction toward the far tree line, and, beyond it, the drainage that eventually narrows into the approach to the Sable Bowl. The first set matched Wyatt's tread exactly, the same distinctive lug pattern we'd been tracking since the second ford. The second set was close in size, maybe a half size larger, an unremarkable generic hiking boot tread, the kind sold by a dozen different outdoor retailers, nothing distinctive about it at all. That, on its own, wasn't strange. Hikers cross paths in popular meadows all the time. Maybe someone else had come through recently, and Wyatt had fallen in with them for company, which happens more often than people think in backcountry culture. Solo hikers find each other. It's one of the nicer, more human parts of this landscape. Dean crouched down and studied the two sets of prints for a long time, longer than he usually spends on trail sign, and I could see him doing the math the same way I was doing it in my head, because the numbers didn't sit right. He pulled out a small, retractable tape measure he carries for exactly this kind of documentation, and worked his way down the mud fringe, measuring the gap between the two tracks at 6 separate points, calling the numbers out to me in a low, flat voice, while I logged them in the incident notebook. 22 feet 1 inch, 21 feet 11 inches, 22 feet even, 22 feet 2 inches. The variance across all 6 measurements never exceeded a couple of inches, a level of consistency that Dean himself admitted, quietly, was tighter than he'd expect from 2 independent hikers walking together at any natural conversational distance, where the gap between 2 people typically drifts by several feet at a time, depending on terrain, fatigue, and simple inattention. "People don't walk like that," he said, mostly to himself, still crouched over the tape measure. "Not on purpose. Nobody paces themselves that exactly for 2 miles without noticing they're doing it." The second set of prints was never beside the first. It was always the same distance behind, measured stride for stride, the exact same offset repeated over and over down the length of the mud fringe, roughly 22 feet, which by my own rough count came out to almost precisely 11 of Wyatt's own strides. Not close behind, the way you'd walk with a companion you were talking to. Not staggered randomly, the way 2 hikers moving at slightly different paces naturally drift apart and catch back up. Fixed. Exact. 11 steps behind. Every single time. For as far as the prints continued, before they entered harder ground and vanished from view. Dean stood up slowly, brushed his hands off on his thighs, and said, in a voice that was working very hard to sound unbothered, that it was probably a second search and rescue volunteer from a neighboring county who'd gotten ahead of official notification. Maybe someone freelancing an unofficial search after hearing about it on the scanner network, which does happen more than agencies like to admit. It was a reasonable theory. It explained the boot type. It explained the presence of a second person on Wyatt's route. Callum, who badly wanted an explanation that didn't require him to think too hard about a fixed 11-step offset repeating for 2 miles of trail, latched onto it immediately and started talking about which neighboring counties ran informal scanner teams. I didn't say anything against the theory out loud that night, because I didn't have a better one to offer, and because the alternative, sitting in the back of my mind at that point, was too vague and too unprofessional to put into a search log. But I remember lying in my sleeping bag that night, in the meadow, doing the math again and again in the dark, trying to make the offset come out to anything other than exactly 11 of Wyatt's strides, every single time, and failing. That's the kind of detail that starts to feel less like a coincidence and more like a measurement. And measurements have a reason behind them, even when you can't see it yet. We didn't find Wyatt Calder on day 2, or day 3, or day 4. The search stretched into what our operation logs call an extended duration incident, the kind that starts eating into resources and morale in equal measure, the kind where the odds calculators the state uses start producing numbers nobody wants to say out loud. We rotated teams in and out, brought in a helicopter for 2 clear weather days to run thermal sweeps over the upper basins, expanded our grid twice, and worked longer hours than any of us should have, because that's what you do when there's still a reasonable chance the person you're looking for is alive. On day 5, Callum was working a section of the Corbin Creek drainage with a second-year volunteer named Reese Okonkwo-Bell. No relation to Renee Okafor, just an unfortunate echo of a name that made me flinch a little every time I heard it on the radio roster that week. They were sweeping a stretch of trail about a mile below where Wyatt's tracks had last been confirmed, and Callum radioed in that he thought he'd heard Dean's voice up ahead on the trail, giving him a redirect toward a drainage that split off to the northeast, toward terrain that edges closer to the Sable Bowl boundary than our search plan called for. Dean was not on that section of trail. Dean was 3 miles away at that exact moment, working the meadow campsite with me, and he had not cried up the radio at all in the previous 20 minutes. Callum swore up and down that it was Dean's voice, specific enough that he could describe the cadence of it, the way Dean tends to clip the ends of his sentences short, a verbal habit that's almost impossible to fake convincingly if you don't know someone well. He said the voice told him and Reese to push northeast, that there was a visual on someone matching Wyatt's description up that drainage. When Dean got on the radio a few minutes later to check in with Callum's team as scheduled, Callum told him what he thought he'd heard, and Dean's voice on the actual radio went flat and careful in a way I recognized from years of working alongside him, the tone he uses when he's deciding how much to say out loud on an open channel. He told Callum, calmly, to disregard the redirect and hold the assigned search grid. He didn't ask any follow-up questions about what the voice had sounded like. He didn't ask Callum to repeat the coordinates it had given him. At the time, I read that as Dean being efficient under pressure, keeping the operation focused instead of chasing down a communications glitch. Looking back, I think Dean already knew exactly what Callum had heard, and he already knew better than to discuss it on an open channel where a dozen other search volunteers and 2 agency radios were listening in. That night, back at base camp, I finally asked Dean directly what he thought was going on. We were sitting a little apart from the rest of the team, coffee gone lukewarm in a thermos between us, and I asked him if this had ever happened before. On a search, this specific kind of thing, doubled voices, offset tracks, a dog that wouldn't cross a stretch of gravel. Dean was quiet long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer at all. Then he asked me if I remembered Renee Okafor. I told him I remembered the name, that I knew she'd gone missing before I joined the team, that I'd seen her photo on the memorial board at the station a handful of times without ever asking anyone the specifics, because it felt like the kind of question you don't ask a chapter that's still raw about a case they never closed. Dean nodded slowly and said that Renee's search had run almost exactly like this one, same drainage, same section near the second ford, and that she had never come out at all. He didn't say anything else that night. He finished his coffee, told me to get some sleep, and that was the end of the conversation for the moment. Though I want you to hold on to it, because it's going to matter enormously in about 20 minutes of story time. And I promised you I wasn't going to forget about Renee. We found Wyatt Calder on the morning of day 9, and I want to describe exactly how, because the how is almost as strange as the fact of it. A different search team, working a grid well below the Sable Bowl boundary near the confluence where Antler Fork meets a smaller unnamed tributary, spotted him from about 400 yards off, moving along the tributary's bank in a straight line, upright, at a slow but steady pace, heading generally in the direction of the trailhead rather than deeper into the wilderness. When they reached him and identified themselves, Wyatt didn't react with the flood of relief and adrenaline you typically see in a successful long-duration find. He looked at the lead searcher, according to her incident report, and asked her what number she was on. She didn't understand the question at first. He asked again, more insistently, "What number?" And when she still didn't answer, he told her, calmly, that he was on 11,400 and something. He'd lost the exact count, somewhere near the confluence, and that he needed someone to help him keep it going, or he was going to have to start over from a checkpoint. And he didn't know if he was allowed to start over from a checkpoint, because nobody had told him the rule for that yet. The searcher, to her enormous credit, kept her voice level, told him he was safe, that they were going to get him out, and got on the radio to call in the find and request medical support to the confluence. By the time our team reached him, roughly 40 minutes later, Wyatt was sitting on a flat rock, exactly where they'd left him, still counting under his breath. A slow, steady, almost metronomic murmur that didn't stop even while the paramedics assessed his leg. His stress fracture was bad enough that we were genuinely surprised he'd walked as far as he had on it. His hydration and caloric deficits were severe, textbook 9-day exposure numbers, the kind that should have left him disoriented, hypothermic adjacent, barely able to stand, let alone navigate independently through 9 miles of unmarked wilderness terrain on a compass bearing that took him, almost precisely, straight toward the trailhead, rather than in any of the wandering, looping patterns you typically see in lost hikers whose judgment has degraded under stress. He didn't wander. Lost people wander. Wyatt Calder walked a straight line home. I asked him, gently, once he was stable enough on the litter carryout to talk, what had happened after the second ford. He looked at me for a long moment, the particular stillness of someone deciding how much of the truth a given listener can hold, and told me that he hadn't been alone since day 3. He said it exactly like that. Flat, matter of fact, no drama in his voice at all. Not alone. He said the other one had been very clear about the rules from the start, and that the rules were simple as long as you kept the count going and didn't look back to check. I asked him what would happen if you looked back. He said he didn't know, because he never had. I remember walking beside that litter for the last mile of the carryout, watching Wyatt's lips keep moving through the count, even while he drifted in and out of a shallow, exhausted sleep, and thinking about Renee Okafor in a way I hadn't let myself think about her in years. I had spent almost a decade telling myself that her case was simply the kind of loss this work occasionally hands you, a statistic you carry professionally rather than personally, a name on a memorial board you learn not to stare at too long. Watching Wyatt come out alive, counting, altered but breathing, I understood all at once that I had never actually made peace with Renee's file the way I'd told myself I had. I had just filed the grief the same way Dean filed his old field notes, in a drawer that stuck a little and needed a specific upward jiggle to open, and told myself that keeping it closed was the same thing as having resolved it. It wasn't. It never had been. And some part of me, walking beside that litter, quietly decided that I was done pretending otherwise. Wyatt was airlifted to the regional medical center from the trailhead, and the operation officially closed as a successful recovery, which on paper it was. A missing hiker, found alive, 9 days after last contact, against odds our incident commander described in the closeout meeting as frankly better than we had any right to expect. There was handshaking. There was a brief write-up in the Coulter's Notch weekly paper with a photo of Wyatt on a hospital bed, giving a thumbs up that made the whole thing look like an inspiring survival story, which, I suppose, on the surface, it was. I didn't feel like celebrating, and neither did Dean, and I think Callum picked up on that faster than either of us expected him to, because about a week after the closeout, he cornered me at the station and asked, point blank, what exactly had been going on with the radio and the tracks. Because he'd been turning it over in his head for days, and couldn't make it add up into anything he could live with as a coincidence. I told him what I knew, which at that point wasn't much more than what I've already told you. And then I told him about Renee, and admitted I still didn't know the details. And the two of us went and found Dean in his office at the station, a converted supply closet with exactly one window and a filing cabinet older than most of our team, and asked him to actually tell us. Dean sat with it for a while, the way he does before any decision he considers weighty, and then he pulled the bottom drawer of that filing cabinet, the one that sticks and needs a specific upward jiggle to open, and took out 3 case files. Renee Okafor's file was the thickest, because hers was the one that never closed. She'd gone missing on a solo overnight trip up Antler Fork 6 years before Wyatt, an experienced hiker, well prepared, a school teacher who'd grown up in Coulter's Notch and knew that drainage better than most professional guides. Her last confirmed location, per her own trip log recovered from her vehicle, was the second ford, logged at 4:52 in the afternoon, almost the same time of day the trail camera had captured Wyatt passing the same spot years later. Her search ran 11 days before it was downgraded from active rescue to recovery, and then, eventually, to unresolved. She was never found. But here's what made my stomach drop, reading Dean's original field notes from that search. At the Meadow campsite, 2 miles past the saddle, the same one where we'd found the 11-step offset in Wyatt's tracks, Dean's 1990 SERA search log described a second set of boot prints running parallel to Renee's, roughly 20 feet behind hers, the entire length of the mud fringe, a distance Dean had noted at the time as unusually consistent, possible companion, unconfirmed. He hadn't measured it in exact strides the way I had, but the distance he'd logged, converted roughly to stride length for a woman of Renee's height, came out close enough to 11 that I felt something cold move through my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature in that cramped little office. The second file was from 9 years before that. A hiker named Foster Chalmers who'd survived, much like Wyatt, walking out after an extended solo disappearance, disoriented but physically ambulatory, and who had spent the rest of his life, according to a follow-up note Dean had added years later after running into Foster's widow at a memorial service, counting things obsessively: steps, dishes, cars passing on the highway, anything with a number attached to it. He died of natural causes a decade after his rescue, but his widow had told Dean, almost in passing, that he'd never once, in all those years, been able to sit through a silence longer than about 30 seconds without starting to count out loud, as though the silence itself made him nervous in a way he could never fully explain. The third file was older still, barely more than a photocopied newspaper clipping and a handwritten note. A trapper named Elson Kettleback himself, one of the family the range was originally named for back in the 1930s, who, according to local record, had walked out of that same drainage after being missing for close to 2 weeks in winter conditions that should have killed him twice over, and who had reportedly refused, for the rest of his life, to walk anywhere with another living person directly behind him. He made everyone walk ahead, or beside, never behind. There was no clinical explanation offered anywhere in the clipping. Just the fact of it, reported the way small towns report an old man's eccentricities with a kind of affectionate bemusement that missed, I think, what he was actually trying to protect himself from. Dean looked at both of us across that cramped little desk and said the thing that reorganized every piece of evidence I'd gathered over the previous 9 days into a shape I finally understood. Callum asked, quietly, how Dean had even known to connect Foster Chalmers' case to Renee's in the first place, given that Foster's disappearance and rescue had happened 9 years before hers, in a different decade, handled by a different generation of volunteers who'd mostly aged out of the chapter by the time Dean himself joined. Dean said he hadn't made the connection at the time. Nobody had. It was only after Renee's search went cold that he'd started pulling old chapter records out of simple, restless frustration, looking for anything, any precedent at all, that might explain what he was looking at in that meadow, and had found Foster's file gathering dust in a box the previous chapter president had never properly archived. He said reading it had felt like finding a language he didn't know he already partially spoke. Individual words suddenly resolving into sentences that made a terrible kind of sense. Once he had 2 data points to compare instead of 1. He said that whatever this was, it didn't seem to want to hurt the people it found. Renee was the only true loss in 6 decades of intermittent incidents in that drainage. And even her case, Dean pointed out quietly, had never actually produced a body, which meant, technically, they didn't know for certain she was dead at all, only that she had never come back. Everyone else who'd encountered it and survived had come out changed but alive, carrying some small, permanent behavioral scar, a compulsion, a rule they couldn't break, a rhythm they couldn't unlearn. I could explain the trail camera blur on its own. I could explain the 11-step offset on its own, twice, if I really pushed myself. What I could not explain, sitting in that office with 3 case files spanning nearly a century spread across Dean's desk, was why every single one of them described the exact same offset, the exact same doubled voice, the exact same insistence on a fixed, unbroken rhythm across 60 years of incidents that had no other connective tissue at all. Different hikers, different seasons, different starting points on the trail, all of it converging on the same drainage, the same behavior, the same rule. That was the moment I stopped thinking of it as something chasing people through the kettlebacks. A predator that simply wanted to catch you wouldn't need to match your stride for 2 miles before making a move. It wasn't hunting in any sense I understood hunting to work. It was learning. It matched a person's rhythm precisely enough for long enough that eventually the 2 rhythms became functionally indistinguishable from each other. And once that happened, once it had fully synchronized to someone's pace, it could lead that rhythm anywhere at all, and the person inside that rhythm would follow without ever quite understanding they had stopped making their own decisions about where their feet were going. Renee, I think now, was the one time it succeeded completely. Everyone else, Wyatt included, was found before the synchronization finished, which is a distinction that matters enormously to what happened later, because it meant the thing in that drainage wasn't finished with Wyatt Calder's rhythm when we pulled him out on day 9. It had simply lost him mid-process, and I don't think, now, that it forgets a rhythm it's already invested that much time learning. I think it waits for another chance to finish. We didn't go back into that drainage again for 6 weeks. And I want to be honest, that part of the delay was operational, and part of it was simple avoidance, the kind nobody on the team said out loud, but all 3 of us understood, without discussing. The operational reason was legitimate enough. Wyatt Calder's abandoned gear, most of it, was still out there. His pack, his primary camera body with 2 lenses worth more than my car, his tent, all of it left somewhere between the meadow campsite and wherever he'd finally been intercepted by whatever had walked beside him for 6 days. Wyatt himself, once he was stable enough to have the conversation, asked us formally through his insurance company to retrieve what we could before winter made the drainage inaccessible, since a chunk of that equipment was his livelihood, and losing it under a season's worth of snowpack meant losing it for good until at least June. Dean assigned the retrieval to me and Callum specifically, which surprised me a little at the time, given that he had far more experience in that drainage than either of us. He told me flatly that his knee, which had been giving him trouble for 2 years, wasn't up for the terrain past the saddle anymore. And I believed that, because it was true. But looking back, I also think Dean had reached his personal limit with that particular stretch of ground, and I don't fault him for it. Not after Renee, not after 2 decades of carrying that unresolved file in the bottom drawer of his desk. The window we had was narrow. An early season storm system was forecast to move in from the coast within 4 to 5 days. The kind of system that dumps 18 inches at elevation and effectively closes the high basins until spring. The access road to the Antler Fork trailhead had also partially washed out in a heavy rain event about 10 days earlier. narrowing to a single unstable lane for the final 2 miles, passable in a high-clearance vehicle but slow and impossible to fix in time to matter. That meant our exit options, if anything went wrong, were more limited than they'd normally be. No easy vehicle extraction close to the trailhead. A long carryout on foot if either of us got hurt, longer than either of us wanted to think too hard about. There was one more piece of the terrain that mattered. Something Dean reminded me of before we left, something I'd actually noted myself during the original search, but hadn't thought much about since. Radio reception in the lower half of that drainage, roughly from the second ford up through the meadow campsite, has always been unreliable. It's a known dead zone, caused by the specific fold of the ridgeline blocking line of sight to our nearest repeater. We'd worked around it for years by carrying a satellite messenger as backup, and simply accepting that for about 2 miles of trail we'd be operating without live radio contact to base. It had never bothered me before. Knowing what I now suspected about that stretch of ground, it bothered me considerably more going in this time. I packed heavier than I normally would for a 2-day retrieval trip. Extra layers, extra food, a backup headlamp, and, though I didn't examine my own reasoning too closely at the time, a small handheld metronome I'd bought at a music store in town 2 days earlier, the kind piano students use, tucked into the top pocket of my pack, where I could reach it without stopping. I told Callum it was for testing a theory. I didn't fully explain the theory, partly because I hadn't finished forming it myself, and partly because I didn't want him walking into that drainage already spooked. The night before we left, Callum showed up at my house unannounced, which he'd never done before, and stood on my porch for a long moment before he finally asked me, flat out, whether I actually thought it was safe for the two of us to go back in there at all, gear or no gear, insurance company or no insurance company. I told him honestly that I didn't know, and that I wouldn't blame him if he wanted Dean to reassign the retrieval to a different pairing, or to push it to spring and simply let the equipment sit under snowpack for a season. Whatever the insurance adjuster had to say about depreciation. He was quiet for a while, standing there in the cold, with his hands jammed in his jacket pockets, and then he said something that stayed with me since, almost word for word. He said that if he backed out now, he thought he'd spend the rest of his time on this team wondering whether he'd actually earned his place on it, or whether he was just someone who showed up for the easy calls and let other people carry the ones that scared him. He said he'd rather go in scared and prepared than stay home and comfortable, and that he trusted me to get us both back out, which was, frankly, more faith than I felt entirely qualified to accept that particular week. I told him the truth back, that I trusted the plan more than I trusted either of us individually, and that the plan only worked if we both followed it exactly. No improvising, no shortcuts, no letting fatigue or frustration talk us into skipping a single deliberate stumble on the way down. He agreed. We shook on it, which felt a little formal and a little ridiculous standing on my porch in the cold, and then he went home to finish packing, and I stayed up another hour repacking my own bag for the 3rd time, checking and rechecking the metronome's batteries, as though the whole operation might genuinely hinge on a 9-volt cell holding its charge. We started up the Antler Fork Trail a little after 7 in the morning. 6 weeks almost to the day after we'd first found Wyatt's trekking pole standing upright in the gravel at the second ford. The cedar stretch was as loud as it had ever been on that first hike in. Jays and squirrels and the creek running high with recent rain, and I remember feeling almost embarrassed by how relieved I was to hear it, as though ordinary forest noise were proof that nothing was wrong, which of course it isn't proof of anything at all, it's just noise, but it felt like reassurance, and I let myself have it. We reached the second ford a little before 11. The 4-foot stretch of gravel where Birch had refused to cross, was unremarkable to look at, indistinguishable from the rest of the bar. No visible mark, no discoloration, nothing a person walking through without that context would ever notice. I stood at the edge of it for a moment longer than I needed to. And Callum, to his credit, didn't ask why, just waited. And then we crossed together, deliberately, side by side rather than single file, which had become an unspoken habit for both of us by that point, without either of us naming it out loud. Nothing happened. I want to be clear about that, because I think it's important to the shape of what this thing actually is. It didn't announce itself at the ford. It didn't need to. I think now it had already decided, 6 weeks earlier, which rhythm in that drainage it still had unfinished business with, and it was patient enough to wait for that rhythm to come back to it, rather than force the issue at a crossing it had already used once. We found Wyatt's camp debris scattered further than expected, some of it a quarter-mile past the meadow, snagged in brush along the creek, as though it had been carried and dropped, rather than simply abandoned in place, which matched something Wyatt had told me during his hospital interview that I hadn't fully processed until I saw the evidence myself, that at some point during those 9 days, he remembered walking with his pack still on his back, unable to remember consciously deciding to keep carrying it, and at some other point later, remembered it simply not being there anymore, without any memory of setting it down. We spent close to 3 hours collecting what we could, cataloging it the way Dean had trained us to, for anything connected to an active or recently active incident file, and it was slow, methodical work that kept both of us focused enough that the strangeness of the surrounding terrain receded into the background for a while, the way any task does when your hands are busy and your attention is narrowed down to the next small, solvable problem in front of you. His pack had wedged itself into a log jam about 40 yards downstream of the meadow, waterlogged and half buried under a season's worth of drifted needles, and it took both of us working together to free it without tearing the fabric further than the creek already had. Most of what was inside had survived better than I expected. A dry bag of spare film, oddly old-fashioned for a photographer who otherwise worked entirely digital, a battered paperback field guide to alpine wildflowers, with his handwriting crowding the margins, a folded topo map gone soft and translucent with water damage, but still legible enough to make out his planned route, 3 separate check marks in pencil at the second ford, one for each day he'd apparently crossed it, though his trip plan had only ever called for crossing it once. His primary camera body turned up, wedged between 2 boulders, another 20 yards on. The housing cracked, but the memory card inside intact, a detail that would matter enormously later, once the images on that card were finally recovered and reviewed by an agency technician who had no context at all for why a handful of the later frames showed nothing but blurred, close-range static, as though the shutter had fired inches from something moving too fast, or too strangely, for the sensor to resolve into any coherent shape. We logged each item by GPS coordinate, photographed it in place before moving it the way Dean's protocol requires, and bagged what we could reasonably carry, leaving the bulkier gear, a collapsed tent, a bare canister, cached and clearly marked under a stand of hemlock for the spring retrieval trip Dean had already tentatively scheduled before either of us had said a single word about what the drainage had shown us that afternoon. It was a little after 3 in the afternoon, with maybe 3 hours of good light left, and the temperature already starting to drop, with the front moving in early, when Callum said something that made the back of my neck go cold in a way 3 hours of steady work hadn't managed to shake loose. He asked me, casually, almost as an aside while he coiled a length of paracord we'd recovered from Wyatt's gear, what number I was on. I asked him what he meant. He looked up at me, a little confused by his own question, the particular confusion of someone who said something out loud before fully registering that they'd been thinking it at all, and told me he didn't know. Exactly, just that it had felt like a natural thing to ask, like checking in on a shared task neither of us had actually agreed to start. Neither of us had been counting anything out loud. I want to be very specific about that. But I'd caught myself, without noticing when it started, falling into my old habit from years of trail work, counting my steps in blocks of 100 as we moved between the meadow and the debris field. And it occurred to me, standing there with Callum's odd little question hanging in the cooling air, that I hadn't actually decided to start counting that day. It had simply been happening underneath my conscious attention, the way a habit sometimes runs on its own without you switching it on deliberately. That was when I understood we needed to move faster than our original plan had allowed for, and that whatever margin I'd assumed we had was smaller than I'd hoped. We finished cataloging what we could reasonably carry, left the rest secured, and marked for a spring retrieval that would ultimately never happen, and started back down toward the second ford a little after 4, racing daylight and the front that was already visible as a gray wall building over the western ridgeline, closer than the forecast had promised. The radio crackled to life about a quarter-mile above the meadow, which surprised me, because we were still well within the known dead zone, and shouldn't have had reliable contact with base for at least another mile of descent. It was Dean's voice, or something wearing the shape of Dean's voice closely enough that Callum answered it without hesitation, out of pure reflex. The voice told us conditions at the trailhead were deteriorating faster than expected, that the access road had washed out further, and that our safest route out was not back down the way we'd come, but up and over a connector spur that cut northeast from the meadow, toward higher ground, toward terrain that any of us who'd studied that drainage's topography would recognize immediately as running directly along the rim of the Sable Bowl. The signal itself was wrong in a way I only understood afterward, once I'd had time to think it through properly. Our repeater-relayed traffic always carries a faint, characteristic hiss under the voice, a texture of static specific to the exact hardware chain between a handheld unit and the tower 40 miles east that bounces our signal back down into the valleys. This transmission had none of it. Dean's voice, or the thing wearing it, came through perfectly clean, studio flat, the kind of clarity our radios have never once produced in 9 years of me using them in that terrain, and I registered the wrongness of that clarity half a second before I consciously understood why it bothered me at all. I did not answer it. I grabbed Callum's arm before he could acknowledge the instruction, hard enough that he flinched, and told him, low and fast, that Dean did not have our position, could not have generated that specific a weather update from base with no working repeater contact, and that the real Dean, whatever was happening right now, was 3 miles and 1 canyon wall away from being able to talk to us at all. Callum's face did something I'll remember for a long time, a kind of visible collapse of certainty. The moment someone realizes the ground they've been standing on for the last several minutes was never actually solid. He asked me, in a voice gone thin and young, how I could be sure. I told him to listen to the cadence of it. Dean clips his sentence endings short, always has. A specific verbal tell almost impossible to fake if you don't know him well. And the voice on our radio wasn't doing that. It was smoother than Dean, more evenly paced, correct in almost every particular except that one small, specific human imperfection that 30 years of a person's actual speaking history leaves behind, and that nothing learning a rhythm from the outside would think to replicate, because it wasn't listening for imperfection. It was listening for pattern. We moved fast after that, faster than the terrain strictly allowed for safely, and I noticed, with a cold, clinical part of my brain that had apparently decided to keep functioning even while the rest of me was afraid, that Callum's footsteps behind me had fallen into an unnervingly precise rhythm with my own, matching my pace stride for stride, in a way that two people moving quickly downhill over uneven ground don't naturally do. I have never once, in 9 years of trail work, walked in perfect synchronized cadence with another person by accident. It doesn't happen. Terrain is too irregular, gait length too individual, attention too divided between footing and everything else. I stopped abruptly at the edge of the meadow, forcing Callum to nearly run into my pack, and told him, as calmly as I could manage, that we were going to break stride on purpose, right now, both of us, and keep breaking it deliberately for the rest of the walk out, no matter how tired that made us, or how much slower it felt. He asked why, and I told him the truth, because there wasn't time left to soften it. I thought whatever had partially synchronized with Wyatt 6 weeks earlier had spent the last hour matching itself to him instead of me, and I thought the radio voice pretending to be Dean had been trying to lead that synchronization somewhere specific, somewhere it couldn't get either of us to walk on our own, and the only tool I had any confidence in was breaking the rhythm before it locked all the way into place. I want to explain, briefly and as clearly as I can, why I believed that would work. Because it wasn't a guess pulled out of panic. I'd spent 6 weeks since the pattern lock conversation with Dean, going back over every detail of every old case file, and one thing was consistent across every single account, going all the way back to Elson Kettleback in the 1930s. Nobody who survived had done so by outrunning it, or fighting it, or finding some hidden landmark that broke a curse. Foster Chalmers, in his own vague account recorded second-hand by his widow, had described stumbling badly on a scree slope near the end of his ordeal, a genuine accidental fall that broke his gait for several minutes, and it was shortly after that fall he'd told her that he'd first felt able to look behind him again without dread. Elson Kettleback's refusal to ever walk with someone directly behind him for the rest of his life wasn't superstition. It was a permanently adopted countermeasure. A man who had learned the hard way that an unbroken rhythm behind him was the exact condition that had nearly cost him everything, and who never let that condition exist again as long as he lived. The pattern in the evidence wasn't luck. It was disruption. Every survivor's account, buried under decades of vague language and half-remembered trauma, pointed to the same underlying mechanism. Whatever this thing does, it requires a steady, learnable rhythm to lock onto and follow. And a broken rhythm gives it nothing to hold. So we broke it, deliberately, brutally, for the last mile and a half, back to the second ford. I made Callum vary his stride length with every third step, sometimes short, sometimes exaggeratedly long, stumbling us both over easy ground on purpose where we didn't need to stumble at all. I pulled the little metronome out of my pack and set it running at a rate neither of us matched, letting it click away against my chest as a kind of decoy. An offered rhythm that wasn't actually either of our own real gaits, hoping, without any way to test the hypothesis, except by staying alive through it, that a false pattern might be as good as no pattern at all if it was consistent enough to compete for attention. I don't know if the metronome mattered. I've never been able to prove that it did. What I do know is that somewhere around the last quarter mile before the ford, in light gone the deep blue-gray of early dusk, I heard footsteps behind us that were not ours, close enough now that I could make out the individual impact of a boot heel against packed dirt, and they were not matching our broken, deliberately arrhythmic stride at all anymore. They were searching, speeding up, slowing down, shifting cadence in small testing increments, the unmistakable sound, now that I finally recognized it for what it was, of something trying to find a pattern that had stopped being there to find. Callum heard it too. I know he did, because his hand found my sleeve and gripped it hard enough to bruise, and neither of us said a single word for the rest of that mile, because talking would have meant breathing in a rhythm, and at that point, I genuinely did not trust anything about my own body not to betray us if I let it settle into any pattern at all, even one as small as speech. About 200 yards above the ford, the trail narrows along a short rock shelf where the drop to the creek below steepens to something close to 15 feet. Nothing technical under normal conditions. A spot we'd both crossed a dozen times without a second thought. But a genuinely bad place to be deliberately breaking your own stride in near dark with an already injured ankle in the mix. Callum's bad foot caught wrong on the uneven cadence I'd forced on both of us. And for one long, silent half-second, I watched him pitch sideways toward the drop, with nothing under his weight but air and momentum. I got a fist into the back of his pack strap before he went over, more instinct than plan, and the two of us went down together onto the rock shelf instead. Hard, my shoulder taking most of the impact against stone that didn't give at all. A bright, specific pain that I filed away to deal with later, because there wasn't time to deal with it now. Callum was breathing too fast, staring at the drop he hadn't gone over. And for one terrible moment, I thought the fall itself might undo the only defense we had, might jolt us both back into some frightened, synchronized flinch that would hand whatever was behind us exactly the rhythm it wanted. It didn't. If anything, the fall helped. An accident violent and unplanned enough that neither of us could have moved predictably through it if we'd tried. And I thought, even in the middle of hauling Callum back to his feet and checking his pupils by headlamp for anything that would suggest a concussion on top of everything else, of Foster Chalmers stumbling on that scree slope decades earlier, and understood, with a clarity that had nothing comforting in it at all, that the ugliest, least controlled moments of that whole descent might have been doing more work than any deliberate stumble we'd planned in advance. We crossed the second ford at a dead, stumbling run, deliberately uneven, and I did not look back once. Not because I was too afraid to, though I was, but because Elson Kettleback's century-old handwritten note, the one Dean had shown us in his cramped little office, had said one more thing neither of us had discussed out loud until that exact moment on the gravel bar, gasping, half falling into the shallow water on the far side. He'd written that he never knew for certain whether looking back would have made things better or worse. He'd simply never been willing to test it. Neither was I. We didn't stop moving until we were half a mile below the ford, on a straight, open stretch of trail where the trees pull back enough to see 50 yards in either direction, and even then, we didn't stop so much as slow, both of us still deliberately breaking our own stride, both of us listening past our own ragged breathing for anything behind us that shouldn't have been there. I heard nothing further. No footsteps, no radio static carrying a voice that wasn't quite Dean's, just whines starting to pick up ahead of the front, and somewhere off to our left, a jay complaining about something, ordinary and small and, at that moment, one of the most reassuring sounds I had ever heard in my life. Callum had turned his ankle badly somewhere in that last stretch of deliberate stumbling. Not broken, we confirmed later at the hospital, but a grade 2 sprain that had him limping heavily by the time we reached the trailhead a little after 8 that night, well past dark, both of us running on headlamps and adrenaline and whatever was left of the granola bars we hadn't eaten during the retrieval work. I splinted it as best I could on the move, and he gritted through it without complaint, which surprised me, given how green he'd been 8 months earlier, given how badly he'd wanted to prove himself on searches where proving himself had mostly meant staying out of the way. He'd more than earned his place on the team by the time we got back to the truck. I told him that, once we were both sitting in the cab with the heater running, and our hands finally starting to feel like hands again, instead of numb, borrowed things attached to our wrists. I radioed base as soon as we had signal again, a mile or so before the trailhead, and got Dean directly, his actual voice this time, with the specific clipped sentence endings I'd been listening for the whole way down, close enough now that the difference between him and whatever had been on our radio earlier felt almost impossible to have ever confused, even though in the moment it hadn't been. I told him what had happened, all of it, in as much order as I could manage with my hands still shaking slightly on the wheel. the false redirect toward the connector spur, the synchronized footsteps, the metronome, the last quarter mile, and the sound of something testing rhythms behind us in the dark, searching for a pattern we'd taken away from it. Dean didn't say much while I talked. When I finished, there was a long pause on the radio, long enough that I checked the display to make sure we hadn't lost the connection. And then he said, quietly, that he was glad we'd both come back the same night, in the same condition, and that he wanted us both at the station first thing in the morning. Not for a debrief in front of the rest of the team, just the three of us, in his office, the one with the sticky bottom drawer. We drove back to Coulter's Notch, mostly in silence, the storm front finally breaking loose behind us, in a hard, cold rain that started about the time we hit pavement. And I remember thinking, watching it come down against the windshield, that we'd gotten out with perhaps 2 hours of margin before that same rain would have made the upper trail genuinely dangerous, before hypothermia risk alone would have complicated everything else we'd been dealing with that day. I don't know if that margin was luck, or good planning, or something else entirely, deciding, once we'd broken its hold on us, that it wasn't worth the effort of following us all the way to the road. I've turned that particular question over more times than I can count, and I've never landed anywhere solid with it. The next morning, in Dean's office, he told us the rest of what he knew, the parts he'd been sitting on, even after showing us the 3 case files 6 weeks earlier. And I understood, hearing it, why he'd waited, and why he'd chosen that particular morning, after we'd both come back alive from the same drainage that had taken so much from him personally over the years, to finally say it out loud. Rene Okafor's satellite messenger, the same model Wyatt had carried, the same model that had transmitted evenly spaced pings right up until the second forward before falling silent, had never been recovered during her original 11-day search. Search teams had covered that drainage exhaustively, grid after grid, for almost 2 weeks, using dogs and, in the later days, thermal imaging from a state helicopter, and found nothing. No pack, no tent, no messenger. Nothing beyond her own boot prints ending at that meadow campsite, the same spot where, years later, we'd find Wyatt's prints running parallel to a second set, exactly 11 strides behind. 2 years after her disappearance, a pair of backcountry hunters, working a route along the upper rim of the Sable Bowl, well past any marked trail above the old mining works, found a satellite messenger wedged into a crevice on a cliff face roughly 60 feet above the canyon floor, in a location with no reasonable climbing route to it from below and no reasonable route to it from above, without specialized gear neither the hunters nor, later, the recovery team Dean sent up actually possessed. They'd needed a rope team and technical anchors just to retrieve it. The device's serial number matched Renee's exactly. Its battery, remarkably, still held a residual charge, and when Dean's team pulled the stored location logs, the last several months of data, dated well after her official disappearance, showed the unit moving, slowly, steadily, in a single, continuous, almost mechanically even line, climbing from the canyon floor toward that crevice over a period of roughly 14 months, at a rate of travel Dean had once calculated, late one night, with nothing better to occupy the calculation, as almost precisely matching Rene Okafor's own average stride length and pace, extrapolated forward, day after day, as though whatever carried it had never stopped walking in her rhythm, even after whatever had happened to her had already happened. Dean told us he'd never put that detail in any official report. There was no way to frame it that wouldn't have sounded like exactly the kind of thing that gets a search and rescue chapter's credibility quietly, permanently discredited with the agencies that fund it. He'd filed the beacon's recovery as an unresolved discovery, logged the coordinates, and locked the raw data logs in that same bottom drawer, next to the case files, where they'd sat for 4 years until the morning he finally showed them to us. What Dean told us next, he'd never put in any file at all, official or otherwise. He and Renee had grown up 2 farms apart, outside Coulter's Notch, known each other since before either of them could properly walk, and had dated, briefly and unremarkably, for about a year in their early 20s, before deciding, mutually and without much drama, that they made better friends than partners. He'd been the one who trained her, informally, in basic backcountry navigation, years before she ever needed a search team of her own, sitting at his kitchen table, teaching her to read a topo map, the same patient. Exacting way he'd later teach half the volunteers on our current roster, myself included. When her search finally closed, downgraded from active rescue to the flat, bureaucratic word unresolved, he'd been the one who had to call her parents and tell them, in careful, measured language, that the county was suspending the search. And he told us, quietly, that he had never once in the years since believed the phrase he'd used on that call. Suspended implies you might resume. He'd known, standing in her parents' kitchen, with the phone still warm in his hand, that they were never going back out for her again. And he had said the word anyway, because it was the word procedure gave him, and procedure was the only thing he had left to hide behind that day. I asked him why he was telling us now, after keeping it to himself for so long. He said that as far as he knew, in 6 decades of intermittent incidents in that drainage, nobody had ever done what Callum and I did the night before. Nobody had broken the rhythm on purpose, deliberately, with enough understanding of what they were fighting to make it work. Foster Chalmers had stumbled into his survival by accident. Elson Kettleback had adopted his countermeasures only after the fact, once it was already over, once he'd already made it home some other way nobody fully understood. We were the first people in the written history of that drainage, as far as Dean could tell, to identify the mechanism while it was actively happening, and use that understanding to escape it on purpose. He said that mattered enough that he didn't want to be the only one carrying it anymore. I went to see Wyatt Calder myself, about 3 weeks after the retrieval trip, once he was out of the hospital and staying with his sister in a rental about 40 minutes outside Coulter's Notch, while his leg finished healing enough to bear weight without a boot brace. I hadn't planned on visiting in any official capacity. Our search had closed months earlier, and there was no procedural reason for me to follow up beyond simple, unresolved curiosity, and, if I'm honest, a need to know whether what happened to Callum and me in that drainage had anything at all in common with what Wyatt himself remembered, or whether we'd simply frightened ourselves into a shape that matched an old family of stories Dean had shown us out of context. Wyatt's sister let me in and left us alone in the kitchen, and he looked better than the last time I'd seen him. Weight coming back, color better, though there was something in his posture, a specific held stillness, that hadn't been there before that trip either, as far as I could tell from the handful of times our paths had crossed before he ever went missing. He asked, almost immediately, before I'd said much of anything, whether we'd gone back into the drainage. I told him we had for the retrieval, and watched something tighten behind his eyes before he asked, carefully, if anything had happened. I told him some of it, enough to be honest without overwhelming him, and he listened without interrupting, nodding slowly at the part about the offset stride, more sharply at the part about the radio voice using Dean's cadence, and by the time I got to the metronome and the final quarter mile of deliberate stumbling, he'd gone very quiet, staring at a spot on the table between us. He told me then, more than he had during his hospital interview, because I think by that point enough time had passed that he'd started to trust his own memory of it again, instead of dismissing it as trauma-distorted nonsense, the way I suspect a well-meaning psychiatrist had gently encouraged him to during his recovery. He said the first 2 days after the second ford, nothing had felt wrong at all. He remembered simply having company, a presence walking a short distance behind him that he never quite turned to look at directly, and remembered feeling, strangely, less alone rather than more afraid. The particular comfort of believing you've fallen in with a fellow hiker on a long solo trip, someone who seemed to know the terrain, who occasionally offered what felt like course corrections. A suggestion here, A redirect there, always phrased in his own head, less like an external voice, and more like a thought arriving that felt entirely reasonable to have. It was on the third day, he said, that the counting started, though he couldn't remember it beginning any more than Callum or I could remember when our own step counting had quietly switched itself on in the meadow. He simply became aware, at some point, that he was keeping a number, and that keeping the number correctly seemed to matter enormously, though he couldn't have told you why, or what the consequence of losing it might have been. He said the presence behind him seemed to want the number kept accurately, more than it wanted anything else, more than it wanted him fed, or rested, or moving in any particular direction at all, at least at first. He told me the rule about not looking back had arrived the same way, not as a spoken instruction he could quote, but as a certainty that simply existed in his head one morning, fully formed, the way you sometimes wake up already knowing today is Tuesday without having to work it out. He didn't know where the certainty had come from. He only knew that breaking it felt, in some deep, wordless part of his body, like it would cost him something he wasn't willing to lose. I asked him whether the presence had ever spoken to him directly, in words, the way the radio voice had spoken to Callum months later. He said not in words, exactly, not the way I meant it. It was closer, he said, to the sensation of a thought arriving that felt like it should have been his own, but carried a texture slightly wrong for his own thinking. A little too smooth, a little too evenly paced. The mental equivalent, he supposed, of Dean's clipped sentence endings gone missing from a voice that was otherwise doing a very good impression of a person he trusted. He said the strangest part wasn't the wrongness of it, it was how easy the wrongness was to ignore, how naturally his mind kept sliding past the discrepancy and accepting the thought as his own anyway. The way you might notice a typo in a familiar sentence and read right through it without your comprehension ever actually stumbling. I asked him if he remembered anything about what it looked like, even indirectly. A shadow, a silhouette, anything. He said the closest he ever came was on the 6th or 7th day. He'd lost precise track by then, when he'd stopped at a small tarn to filter water and caught, in the still surface of the pool, a reflection of the tree line behind him that included, for just a moment before a breeze broke the water's surface, a shape standing at the same 11-stride distance he'd apparently, unconsciously, already been maintaining without ever having measured it himself. He said it hadn't looked like a person exactly, and it hadn't looked like anything else exactly either. It had looked, he said, slowly, like his own outline, seen from behind, the specific slope of his own shoulders, and the particular way his pack sat, slightly crooked, on his left side, from an old strap adjustment he'd never bothered to fix, reflected back at him from a source that was not himself, and was not, as far as he could tell in that half-second before the water moved, standing anywhere close enough to the tarn to be casting a real reflection into it at all. He said he hadn't told the paramedics that part. He hadn't told the trooper, or the psychiatrist, or, until that afternoon in his sister's kitchen, anyone at all. I asked him, finally, the question I'd been building toward, without quite admitting it to myself the whole visit, whether he thought it was trying to hurt him or trying to become him. He thought about that for a long time before he answered, longer than he'd taken with anything else I'd asked. Then, he said, he didn't think it had a word for what it was doing, any more than a river has a word for erosion. It wasn't cruelty, as far as he could tell. It was closer to a very old, very patient kind of practice, the way a person might learn a piece of music by playing it over and over until their hands stopped needing to think about where to go next. He said he thought it had been practicing being a person that way for a very long time, one borrowed rhythm at a time, and that most of what it took from the people it practiced on wasn't their lives. It was something smaller, and, in its own way, worse. A little of the certainty that your own footsteps, in your own body, belong entirely to you and nobody else. He still counts. He told me that without my having to ask, holding up his hand and showing me, almost apologetically, that his fingers were tapping a slow, steady beat against the table edge. One he said he did constantly now, awake or half asleep, a habit his sister had learned to simply not comment on anymore. He sleeps with a sound machine running white noise at all hours, because true silence, he said, made the tapping feel insufficient somehow, made him feel like he needed to be doing more to hold his own rhythm together than his hands alone could manage. He sold his backcountry gear within a month of getting out of the hospital and hasn't been past a paved trailhead since. He photographs suburban gardens now, he told me, with something like rueful humor in his voice, close focus work, flowers and hedges, and the occasional cooperative backyard bird, and he says it pays worse, but it lets him sleep, which is a trade he's more than willing to make. The official incident report on the Calder search, the one that went into our chapter's permanent file and up the chain to the state coordinating agency, does not mention any of this. It couldn't, not without effectively ending several careers and inviting a level of institutional scrutiny that would have made our chapter's future funding and credibility, already stretched thin in a rural county with limited resources, essentially impossible to maintain. It describes a textbook, if unusually prolonged, extended duration wilderness search, complicated by difficult terrain and a genuine medical emergency, resulting in a successful recovery. It attributes Wyatt's disorientation and unusual behavior at the point of contact to acute psychological stress, consistent with prolonged solo exposure, a real and recognized clinical phenomenon that, on its own, explains a meaningful fraction of what happened, without requiring anyone to believe in anything stranger than the well-documented ways extended isolation can affect the human mind. I signed that report. I stand by most of what's written in it, as far as it goes. It just doesn't go very far. Dean did make one change to our chapter's operating procedures that fall, though. One that raised a few eyebrows at the regional coordinators meeting where he presented it, framed carefully as a general best practice update rather than anything specific to a single incident. He formally recommended that any K-9 refusal to cross a defined point during an active search be treated, going forward, as a mandatory pause and reassess trigger for the entire team, rather than logged and worked around as a minor behavioral anomaly. The way Priya's report on Birch had originally been handled, it passed without much debate. Most of the room, I suspect, assumed it was simple caution born of a near miss they didn't have the full context for, which was, in its own careful way, exactly true. He made one further quiet change that never went to any regional meeting at all, something he handled entirely within our own chapter. Every hasty team operating in the Antler Fork drainage now carries a second, independent handheld radio pre-programmed to a direct simplex frequency that bypasses the regional repeater entirely, useless for reaching base at any real distance, but capable of letting two team members confirm each other's identity, voice to voice, at close range, without routing through any relay that something patient enough might eventually learn to imitate. It's a small, almost old-fashioned redundancy, the kind of low-tech workaround that would have seemed unnecessary to anyone who hadn't spent a night listening to a voice that sounded almost, but not quite, like someone they trusted. If you're the kind of person who wants the actual case numbers behind all three of those older files, Renee's, Foster Chalmers's, and the Kettleback Trapper's handwritten note, along with the full transcript of Dean's original 1990s field log and the recovery report on that beacon, I do keep an extended archive for channel members, mostly because there's context in those documents I genuinely can't lay out here without running longer than any single video reasonably should, and some of it involves details about surviving family members that I've chosen to handle a little more carefully than a public upload allows. If you want to go that deep into it, joining the channel gets you access to the full file. I'd rather you hear it properly than not at all. Callum stayed on the team. I want to say that plainly, because I think it matters more than it might seem to from the outside. A lot of people, after a night like the one we had coming down from the meadow, would have quietly let their certification lapse and found a reason not to renew it come spring, and nobody would have blamed them for it. Callum didn't do that. If anything, he got more serious about the work, more careful, the kind of careful that comes from having genuinely understood, in his body, and not just in theory, what it means when a search stops being a procedure and starts being a live, immediate danger to the people running it. His ankle healed clean, no lasting damage beyond a little stiffness in cold weather that he says he barely notices anymore. What didn't heal quite the same way was his relationship with silence. He told me, maybe 8 months after the retrieval trip, that he'd started leaving music playing low in his apartment at all hours, something he'd never done before, because full silence had started to feel, in his words, less like an absence of sound and more like a held breath, waiting to see what he'd do with it. He still breaks his stride on purpose sometimes, on trails that have never given either of us a single reason to think anything is wrong with them. A small, private habit he's never fully explained to anyone else on the team, though I suspect most of them have noticed and simply chosen, out of the particular courtesy people in this line of work extend to each other, not to ask. I changed more than my hiking habits, though those changed plenty. I stopped taking solo training hikes on unfamiliar terrain, a practice I'd relied on for years to keep my fitness and navigation skills sharp between call-outs, and started scheduling them with a partner instead, always, no exceptions, even when it meant delaying a session by a day or two to find someone free. When I do hike alone now, which happens occasionally, call-outs don't wait for convenient company. I keep a folding pocket metronome clipped to my pack strap, not because I've ever proven to my own satisfaction that it does anything at all, but because the 2 hours it might have bought Callum and me on that last stretch down from the meadow are 2 hours I am not willing to gamble away a second time on the strength of a theory I can't fully test without risking exactly the outcome I'm trying to prevent. I also stopped walking with anyone directly behind me, on any trail, for any reason, the same rule Elson Kettleback adopted 100 years before either of us was born. I didn't consciously decide to start doing that. I noticed, maybe 4 or 5 months after the retrieval trip, that I'd been unconsciously arranging every group hike I led so that I was never the lead position with someone falling in exactly behind me, always angling slightly to the side, always keeping at least one other person visible in my peripheral vision, rather than trusting my ears alone to track what was there. Once I noticed the pattern, I made it deliberate instead of accidental, and I've kept it ever since. Dean retired from active fieldwork about 1.5 years after the Calder search. Though he still runs training sessions and sits on our chapter's advisory board, a transition he'd apparently been planning for a while before any of this happened. So I don't think it was directly caused by the drainage, though I also don't think it hurt his decision to move that timeline up slightly rather than push it back the way a man that dedicated to the work might otherwise have been tempted to. He handed the bottom drawer of that filing cabinet over to me formally, in a small, almost ceremonial gesture that neither of us commented on directly, along with a 4th folder I hadn't seen before, one he'd apparently started compiling himself in the months after our retrieval trip, containing everything Callum and I had reported, written up in Dean's own careful, economical hand, the same way he'd documented Renee's case decades earlier. I keep that drawer now. I've added one more folder to it since, and I hope, genuinely, that it stays the last one for a long time. Priya retired Birch from active search work about 2 years after the incident, not because of anything connected to the second Ford specifically. He was simply reaching the age where his joints couldn't handle the terrain reliably anymore. But she told me once, over coffee, that she'd noticed something in the months following our retrieval trip that she'd never mentioned in any official capacity, because there was no way to document it that wouldn't have sounded absurd on paper. Birch, she said, had started refusing a handful of other spots around the county that had no obvious connection to each other at all. Brief, isolated refusals, lasting only a few seconds before he'd shake it off and continue working normally. Nothing like the fixed, immovable stance he'd shown at the second ford. She'd started keeping a private log of the locations, out of nothing more than professional habit. And when she finally laid them out on a county map one evening, more out of curiosity than any real expectation of finding a pattern, she found that every single one sat along a rough, meandering line that traced, as closely as informal data like that can trace anything, the historical drainage boundary of Antler Fork as it existed before a series of small landslides had reshaped the lower creek system sometime in the early 20th century, decades before any topographic survey had recorded the change. She showed me the map itself. Once, an old county plat sheet with her own pencil marks dotted along that faded historical boundary line, 7 points in all, spanning a stretch of terrain nearly 9 miles from end to end, far wider than the narrow section of trail any of us had ever personally associated with the second ford. 2 of the points fell on land that isn't even public anymore. Private timber holdings Birch had crossed briefly during unrelated training exercises years apart from each other. Incidents Priya had logged at the time as unremarkable. A young dog being cautious, nothing worth flagging. It was only laying all 7 points side by side years later that the shape of them stopped looking random. I asked her if she'd told Dean. She said she had, quietly, and that he'd looked at the map for a long time without saying much. The same particular stillness I'd come to recognize from him by then, and had simply asked her to keep logging any future refusals, no matter how small, no matter how far from Antler Fork they seemed to fall. I don't know what to do with that information, beyond simply passing it along to you the way Priya passed it along to me, quietly, without much elaboration, because there isn't much elaboration either of us can honestly offer. Maybe it means the thing in that drainage isn't confined to the specific stretch of trail we've all been picturing this whole time. Maybe it means old boundaries matter to it in a way current maps don't capture. Maybe it's nothing at all, a coincidence built entirely out of one anxious woman's careful record keeping and a dog getting older and pickier about where he plants his feet. I genuinely don't know. And at a certain point in this work, you learn to sit with not knowing, rather than forcing an explanation, just to feel settled again. I want to tell you about one more trip, because I think it belongs at the end of this rather than left out, even though it's the part I've had the hardest time deciding how much to say about. About 14 months after the retrieval trip, on a clear, cold morning in late autumn, almost exactly the same time of year Wyatt Calder had first gone missing, I went back to the second ford alone. I didn't tell Dean I was going, and I didn't tell Callum either, which I'm not proud of. But I think if I'd told either of them, one or both would have insisted on coming with me. And part of what I needed to know, going in, was whether I could stand at that ford by myself and still trust my own reading of the ground without someone else's presence coloring the outcome. I filed a trip plan with the ranger station the way I'd tell anyone to, told them I'd be back well before dark, and left my truck at the same trailhead I'd parked at twice before, in weather cold enough that my breath hung visibly in front of me the whole first hour, the same way it had on the very first morning we'd gone in after Wyatt. I want to be honest about my reasons, because I've turned them over enough times since that I think I finally understand them, even though I didn't fully understand them the morning I set out. Part of it was professional. Our chapter still runs training routes through the lower kettlebacks every season, and I needed to know, for the sake of every future volunteer I might ever send up that trail, whether the second ford still carried whatever it had carried the year before, or whether Wyatt's near completion and our escape had somehow used it up, satisfied it, sent it looking elsewhere the way Priya's scattered data seemed to suggest it might already be doing. Part of it though, and this is the part I find harder to say out loud, was personal. I wanted to stand on that gravel bar on my own 2 feet, under my own control, and prove to some old, stubborn, frightened part of myself that the ground itself hadn't beaten me, whatever might or might not still be using it. I brought the metronome, clipped to my chest strap where I could feel its small mechanical tick against my sternum with every step. I brought a whistle, a backup radio, extra layers, and, at the bottom of my pack, wrapped in a plastic bag, a single item I'd debated bringing for weeks, before finally deciding to, one of Wyatt's abandoned trekking poles, the twin of the one we'd found, standing upright in the gravel that very first day, retrieved during the equipment retrieval and never claimed by his insurance company, once he'd decided he was done with backcountry gear entirely. I'm not a superstitious person by nature. 9 years of search and rescue work tends to strip a certain kind of magical thinking out of you, replace it with procedure and probability, and hard, physical evidence. But I'd read enough of Dean's old files by then, and heard enough of Wyatt's own halting account, to want to leave something behind at that ford that had once belonged to someone it had almost finished with, planted the way the original pole had been planted, deliberately, upright. A kind of marker whose exact purpose I couldn't have fully articulated even to myself. Call it a superstition. Anyway, I've made my peace with that. I broke my stride the entire approach, out of habit as much as caution by that point, varying my pace across the same stretches of trail. I could probably have walked blind after so many passes. The cedar grove loud around me with jays, and the particular hollow knock of a woodpecker working a snag somewhere off to my right. Ordinary forest sounds that felt, this time, less like reassurance, and more like something I was actively listening past, straining for whatever might be underneath it the way I'd learned, without ever wanting to learn it, to listen for a doubled voice, hiding just beneath a familiar one. I reached the second ford a little before noon, in flat gray light, with high clouds moving in from the coast, the same gravel bar, the same stand of alder splitting the current, the same 4-foot stretch of ground where Birch had planted his feet and refused to move 14 months earlier. I stood at the edge of it for a long time, longer than I'd planned to, watching the water run high and cold over stones that hadn't moved position, as far as I could tell, since the very first morning I'd stood there looking for a missing man's boot prints. Nothing happened, for a long time. No echo under my own breathing, no footsteps testing a rhythm I wasn't giving it. Just the creek, and the wind starting to pick up ahead of whatever weather those high clouds were dragging in behind them, and my own metronome ticking away against my chest, small and steady and, in that particular silence, almost absurdly loud. I want to tell you, it felt like nothing was there at all, and, for a long stretch of that hour, standing on that gravel bar in the flat gray light, that's exactly how it felt. I nearly convinced myself of it. I'd almost decided, standing there, that whatever had partially synchronized with Wyatt and then with Callum had genuinely moved on, following Priya's scattered data north or east or wherever a century-old drainage boundary might have led it, and that the second ford, at least for now, was just a ford again, ordinary water over ordinary stones, nothing underneath the surface but cold and current, and the small, mundane persistence of a landscape doing what landscapes do. Then I planted Wyatt's trekking pole in the gravel, in almost exactly the spot the original one had stood, driving the tip down into the wet stones with more force than the task strictly required. A small, physical release for 4 seasons of accumulated tension I hadn't fully realized I was still carrying until I felt it leave my shoulders in the act of setting that pole upright and stepping back from it. And that was when I heard it, once clear and unmistakable, and close enough that every hair on my arms rose at once beneath my jacket. A single footstep on the far side of the ford, landing at a distance and an angle that would have put whoever made it exactly 11 of my own strides behind the spot where I was standing, if I had been walking at all, which I was not. I had been standing still for the better part of an hour. I did not turn around. I want to be completely clear about that. because it's the single decision from that whole trip I am most certain, with total confidence, that I made correctly. I did not turn around, and I did not run, because running is its own kind of rhythm, one of the most predictable rhythms a frightened human body knows how to produce, driven by adrenaline into a pace almost anyone could learn to match if they'd had a century of practice matching human strides under far worse conditions than a clear autumn morning at a familiar creek crossing. Instead, I did the only thing I'd come prepared to do, the only tool I actually trusted, the same tool that had gotten Callum and me down off that mountain 14 months earlier, when nothing else in my training or experience had a single useful answer to offer. I broke pattern on purpose, deliberately, immediately, stepping sideways into the shallow edge of the current itself, cold water flooding my boot instantly. An irregular, unplanned, entirely unrhythmic motion that no predictive pattern built from watching me stand motionless for an hour could have anticipated. And then I turned, not to look behind me toward whatever had made that single footstep, but at an angle deliberately oblique, moving upstream along the near bank in a stumbling, sideways scramble that had no cadence to it at all. Nothing a century of patient practice could have found any purchase in. I heard nothing further. No second footstep. No doubled voice threading itself under the sound of water. Just my own breathing, ragged and too loud in my own ears. And the specific, focused, entirely undramatic business of getting myself back onto the trail and moving in broken, irregular strides, away from that ford, away from that gravel bar, away from a trekking pole I left standing exactly where I'd planted it, upright, driven into wet stone, the way you'd leave an offering or a marker, or, if I'm honest with myself about what I actually believe happened out there, a kind of quiet, deliberate message to whatever still walks that drainage, that it had been seen and understood, and that at least one person standing on that ground knew exactly what game it was playing and had no intention of playing it again. I made it back to the trailhead a little after 2 that afternoon, hours ahead of my planned return time, soaked to the knee on one side, cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature, and sat in my truck for a long time before I trusted my hands enough to actually drive. I didn't call anyone that night. I sat with it, the way you sometimes have to sit with a piece of evidence before you know what shape it's actually going to take, once you've had time to look at it properly, instead of reacting to it in the moment. The drive back to town that afternoon felt longer than the actual mileage justified, and I remember stopping once, halfway down the access road, to sit with the engine off and just listen to the ordinary sound of wind moving through roadside brush, checking, almost obsessively, that I could still hear the difference between an ordinary silence and the kind that had settled over that ford right before I'd heard the footstep. I could. That distinction mattered to me more than I expected it to. A small, private confirmation that whatever had happened out there hadn't cost me the one instinct I most needed to trust going forward. I told Dean about the trip eventually, about 2 weeks later, over the same lukewarm coffee ritual we'd fallen into during the original search, and he listened the way he always listens, still and careful and giving nothing away, until he'd heard the whole of it. When I finished, he didn't scold me for going alone, which I'd half expected, and he didn't tell me I'd been reckless, though I think we both understood that I had been, at least a little. He said, instead, that in 20-some years of carrying that drawer, he had never once gone back to that ford on purpose, outside of active search operations, and that he wasn't sure whether that made me braver than him or simply younger, with less accumulated weight, telling me exactly how much a person stands to lose out there if a single calculation goes wrong? I told him I thought it was probably both. He asked me, then, whether I regretted going, and I had to sit with that question longer than I expected to before I answered it honestly. I told him I didn't regret it, not because the footstep on the far bank hadn't frightened me. It had, more thoroughly than almost anything else that whole year, but because I'd needed to know whether the fear I'd been carrying since the retrieval trip was still proportionate to something real, or whether it had quietly calcified into something closer to superstition, a story I was telling myself to explain an ordinary landscape I'd simply stopped trusting. The footstep answered that question for me, cleanly and without any ambiguity. I've been able to argue myself out of since. Whatever's out there hadn't gone anywhere. It had simply been waiting, the same patient, unhurried way it had apparently been waiting for the better part of a century before any of us ever set foot on that gravel bar. Dean nodded slowly at that. The particular economical nod he uses when he's decided a piece of reasoning holds up under his own scrutiny, and didn't push the subject any further, which from Dean is its own kind of endorsement. What I know now, that I didn't fully understand standing in that cedar grove on the very first morning of the Calder search, is that whatever moves through the Antler Fork drainage isn't hunting the way anything in nature hunts. It doesn't stalk, it doesn't ambush, it simply waits, with a patience that outlasts individual human lifespans by a wide, uncomfortable margin, for a rhythm it can begin, slowly, carefully, to learn, and it seems to prefer, if prefer is even the right word for something operating on whatever logic governs it, borrowing a life over ending one. Renee Okafor may be the one true exception in 6 decades of documented incidents, or she may simply be the one case where the learning process ran to completion before anyone thought to interrupt it, which is a distinction that matters enormously to how frightened you should be of that drainage, and one I genuinely cannot answer with any confidence, no matter how many nights I've spent turning it over. What I teach new volunteers now, when I run training sessions for our chapter, isn't officially written into any manual, and it never will be, because there's no way to write it down that survives contact with a state coordinating agency's credibility standards. But I teach it anyway, quietly, individually, to every single person who joins our team and eventually earns enough trust to hear the fuller version of what happened during the Calder search. I teach them to notice their own stride. I teach them to break it, deliberately, on any long solo approach through unfamiliar terrain, not because I can prove with certainty that it matters everywhere, but because I know, beyond any reasonable doubt, that it mattered once, in one specific drainage, on one specific night, for 2 specific people who are both still here to tell you about it because we did. I teach them Elson Kettleback's rule too, the one about never letting anyone walk directly behind you on ground you don't fully trust. And most of them laugh a little the first time they hear it, the way you'd expect any reasonable person to laugh at an old backcountry superstition passed down from a man who died decades before any of them were born. I let them laugh. I don't force belief on anyone. I just make sure they know the rule exists and where it came from, and I trust that if the day ever comes when they need it, some quiet, wordless part of their training will remember it for them, the same way some quiet, wordless part of me apparently remembered how to count my own steps in blocks of 100. Years before I ever had a reason to be grateful I did. Wyatt Calder sent me a photograph about a year after our kitchen conversation. No note attached beyond a single line asking if I was still doing this work. It was a close focus shot of a hydrangea in what I assume was his sister's backyard. Technically excellent, the way all his work has always been. Soft light, perfect depth of field, the kind of image that would have looked equally at home in any garden magazine in the country. In the bottom corner of the frame, almost accidentally included, was the edge of a small kitchen timer sitting on the porch railing beside him. The mechanical kind you twist to set, ticking down some interval I have no way of knowing the purpose of. I zoomed in on that corner of the image more times than I'd like to admit, trying to read the dial's position against the light, and never could make out the number with any confidence. Some mornings, I've decided it doesn't matter what he set it for. Other mornings, usually the ones where I've woken up from a dream I can't fully remember, except for the sound of something walking at a steady, patient distance behind me, I find myself wondering whether he keeps it running at all hours the way I keep the metronome clipped to my pack, a small mechanical anchor holding down one corner of an otherwise ordinary afternoon. I don't think it was accidental at all. I think he wanted me to see it, the same way I suppose I wanted him to know, without either of us having to say it directly, that neither of us had fully put down the habits that drainage left us with, and that we didn't especially want to. I still lead search crews into the Kettleback Range every fall. I still count in blocks of 100 on long approaches, and I still break that count deliberately every so often, on trails that have never given me a single objective reason to think anything is wrong with them, because objective reasons were never really the point. The point is that somewhere up past the second ford, past the meadow where a schoolteacher's boot prints once ran parallel to something else's for the length of a mud fringe and never quite caught back up, there's a rhythm still waiting for the next person careless enough, or unlucky enough, or simply unprepared enough to let their own footsteps settle into something steady enough to learn. Last spring, I took a new recruit up that same stretch of trail for her first training hike. A 19-year-old named Priya's niece, actually, sharp and eager in the way Callum used to be, and about half a mile below the second ford, without any prompting from me, I caught myself falling into an uneven, deliberately broken cadence I hadn't consciously decided to start. She noticed after a few minutes and asked, a little amused, whether I always hiked that way, whether it was some kind of interval training I hadn't mentioned in orientation. I told her it was a habit I'd picked up a while back, and that I'd explain the rest of it properly once she'd been on the team a little longer. She laughed, said fair enough, and matched her own steps to mine without thinking twice about it. The easy, trusting way new volunteers fall into step behind whoever's leading. And I didn't correct her positioning, not that day, not yet, though I made a note to before we ever came back this way again. I keep a trekking pole standing upright in that gravel bar, because I wanted to know, every time I pass through, that at least one set of boots on that trail has never once forgotten to keep breaking its own stride. I was standing beside the ambulance when they brought Daniel Mercer out of the woods, and the first thing he asked me was whether we had found the other man. I remember looking at the paramedic because I thought I had heard him wrong. Daniel had been missing for 11 days. There was no other man in the search report, no second hiker, no companion, no hunting party, no indication that Daniel had entered the wilderness with anyone. But Daniel kept asking the same question. "Did you find him?" The paramedic leaned closer and told him to conserve his strength. Daniel grabbed the front of the paramedic's jacket. I mean the man behind me. That was when I looked toward the tree line. There was nobody there. At least, nobody I could see. The search team had spent almost 12 hours reaching the ridge where Daniel was found. We had crossed 2 drainage channels, climbed through a section of burned timber, and followed a faint trail that hadn't appeared on any of the maps we were using. Daniel was sitting on the ground beside a dead spruce when we found him. He wasn't trapped. He wasn't badly injured. He wasn't delirious in the way I had expected after 11 days without proper food, shelter, or medical attention. He was exhausted, dehydrated, and badly blistered, but he was conscious. And he was absolutely certain that somebody had been walking behind him. If you enjoy wilderness mysteries where the explanation gets worse the closer you get to it, subscribe and stay with me. Because what happened to Daniel wasn't just a missing person search, and the most disturbing evidence wasn't found in the woods that day. It was found 3 weeks later, Inside a search photograph. My name is Ethan Cole. At the time this happened, I was 36 years old and working as a wilderness search and rescue coordinator for a county emergency management office in western Montana. I had been doing search work for just over 9 years. Before that, I'd spent 6 years as a wildland firefighter, which meant I was comfortable with terrain that most people found intimidating. I knew how quickly weather could turn in the mountains. I knew what dehydration did to decision making. I knew how people behaved when they were lost. Most importantly, I knew that missing hikers usually left evidence. Sometimes it was obvious. Sometimes it was no more than a broken branch, a dropped wrapper, a footprint in soft ground, or a place where someone had sat down for a few minutes. People moved through landscapes differently when they were frightened. They cut corners. They followed water. They chose the easiest slope. They made mistakes. Even experienced hikers left a trail of decisions behind them. Daniel Mercer had left almost nothing. That was what bothered me before we ever found him. Daniel was 42, an experienced backpacker, and the kind of person who annoyed search coordinators because he knew enough about the wilderness to make his own decisions. He wasn't reckless. That distinction matters. Reckless people do stupid things because they don't understand the consequences. Experienced people sometimes do stupid things because they understand the consequences and believe they can manage them. Daniel had been hiking in the Granite Creek wilderness for years. He knew the trails. He carried a satellite communicator. He had a paper map. He had a compass. He had enough food for 4 days, even though his planned trip was supposed to last 2. His wife, Melissa, told us that was normal for him. He doesn't like being underprepared, she said. That sentence stayed with me, because 11 days later, when we found Daniel, he was carrying almost everything he had taken into the mountains. Almost everything. That distinction became important. Daniel disappeared on a Tuesday. He left his home shortly after 6 in the morning and drove approximately 90 minutes to the Granite Creek trailhead. His planned route was straightforward. He intended to hike north along the Granite Creek Trail, spend one night near a backcountry lake called Mirror Basin, and return the following afternoon. He sent Melissa a message from the trailhead at 8:17 a.m. Parked. Weather looks good. Should be back tomorrow evening. That was the last message she received. At 7:40 the next morning, she contacted the county sheriff's office. Initially, nobody considered it an emergency. That sounds strange now, but there were reasonable explanations. Daniel had a satellite communicator. His vehicle was still at the trailhead. The weather had deteriorated overnight, with heavy rain below 6,000 feet and snow above it. There was no indication of injury, no distress message, no emergency activation. And Daniel had previously spent longer than planned in the wilderness. But by Thursday afternoon, his wife was convinced something was wrong. By Friday morning, we had an active search. I was assigned to the incident as the operations coordinator. The first thing I did was reconstruct Daniel's planned route. The second thing I did was ask whether anyone had seen him. The third thing was to determine whether his satellite communicator had transmitted anything after the trailhead. It hadn't. The device had checked in from the trailhead at 8:16. Nothing after that. No tracking points. No emergency message. No failed transmission. Nothing. That bothered me. Satellite communicators aren't magic, but even under poor conditions, they can usually produce some indication that the device is attempting to communicate. Daniels had simply gone silent. His truck was exactly where he had left it, locked. His spare clothes were in the cab. His wallet was in the center console. The parking receipt was still on the dashboard. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken glass, no blood, no abandoned equipment. The truck told us Daniel had entered the trail on foot. After that, we had to determine where he went. The first search team followed the main trail. They found his boot prints approximately 300 yards from the trailhead. Then the tracks disappeared. Not gradually. They simply stopped. The soil became rocky in that area, so this wasn't unusual. But there was another detail. A ranger named Paul Haskins had been the first person to inspect that section. Paul had worked in the district for 18 years. He called me on the radio around noon. "Ethan, come take a look at something." I walked up the slope. Paul was standing beside a large granite slab. He pointed down. "There." At first, I saw nothing. Then I noticed a faint depression in the wet soil. A footprint. Daniel's boot pattern matched it. There was another one. Then another. They led away from the trail, not toward Mirror Basin, away from it. I followed them for perhaps 50 yards. Then Paul stopped me. "Don't follow those yet." "Why?" He pointed at the ground. There were 2 sets of prints, Daniel's, and another set. The second set was larger. The tread pattern was different. The strange thing wasn't that another person had been there. The strange thing was the direction. Daniel's prints were heading uphill. The other prints were heading downhill. They crossed. Then the second set stopped, right beside Daniel's last visible footprint. Paul crouched. He touched the mud with 2 fingers. "These are fresh." "How fresh?" "Hours, maybe less." "Could be another searcher?" Paul shook his head. "We haven't sent anyone up here." That didn't mean much yet. Search teams were moving through the area. Hunters occasionally used the same access roads. There were old logging routes everywhere. Someone could have walked through. We marked the location and continued searching. At the time, I considered this second set of footprints a minor curiosity. I was wrong. We spent the next 2 days covering the basin. Nothing. No Daniel, no shelter, no food wrappers, no fire, no equipment, no clear trail. On Saturday evening, the weather turned. Rain became sleet. Temperatures dropped sharply after sunset. We suspended the ground search overnight. The next morning, a helicopter crew spotted something from the air, a strip of orange fabric caught in a dead tree. We sent a team to investigate. It was Daniel's rain jacket. It had been torn across one sleeve. The jacket was hanging approximately 9 feet above the ground. That was the first detail that made me uncomfortable. There were no branches below it capable of catching the fabric. It looked as though someone had deliberately placed it there. Paul thought it might have been blown upward. I wasn't convinced, but we couldn't prove anything. We expanded the search area. On Sunday, one of our dog teams picked up a scent. The dog led its handler northeast, not toward the lake, not toward the trail, toward a drainage we had already searched. The dog stopped beside a fallen pine. The handler reported that the scent was strongest near the trunk. We searched the area. Nothing. No clothing, no equipment, no footprints. Then the dog started whining. It backed away from the tree. The handler called it back. We moved on. That afternoon, we received the first clue that Daniel might still be alive. A satellite communicator ping appeared in the system. It was weak, incomplete, but it was there. The signal had come from approximately 7 miles north of the trailhead. That was impossible. Daniel's communicator had been silent for almost 5 days. We attempted to send a message. No response. We tried again. Nothing. Then another ping appeared. Same area. 7 miles north. Paul looked at the map. That's beyond Mirror Basin. How far? Depends which route he took. There isn't a maintained route. Paul didn't answer. I zoomed in. There was an old service road. It hadn't been used in decades. According to our records, it ended at a former forestry observation station. The station had been abandoned in the late 1980s. I asked Paul if anyone still went there. He stared at the map for a long time. Not officially. What does that mean? It means there isn't supposed to be a reason for anybody to go there. That afternoon, we assembled a team. 6 people, 2 medics, 2 search technicians, Paul, and me. We planned to move north at first light. The weather forecast gave us roughly 10 hours before another storm system moved in. We had no reason to believe Daniel was at the old station, only the satellite signal. But that was enough. At 6:12 Monday morning, we left the trailhead. The route was difficult. The old service road had been reclaimed by the forest. Trees had grown through sections of it. Mud covered the lower portions. In several places, we had to cross around washouts. We moved slowly. At 10:40, we reached the old station. There was almost nothing left. A concrete foundation, a rusted metal cabinet, several collapsed beams. The roof was gone. We searched the site. No Daniel. Then one of the medics found a footprint. It was fresh, still sharply defined. The boot size appeared to match Daniel. Paul crouched beside it. Look at the direction. The print pointed toward the north side of the foundation. We followed. There were more. One every few feet. Then another set appeared. The larger tread. The same pattern we'd seen near the trailhead. The 2 sets of footprints continued together. Daniel and the unknown person. Side by side, we followed them for almost a mile. At one point, the tracks disappeared over exposed rock. Then they returned. But something had changed. Daniel's footprints were deeper, uneven, dragging slightly. The second person's prints remained perfectly regular. Step after step. Same spacing, same depth, same direction. I remember thinking that the second person looked more comfortable out there than Daniel did. Then we found the first piece of evidence that changed the search completely. A water bottle. Daniel's. It was lying beside a tree. The cap was missing. There was still water inside. And written across the bottle in black marker were 4 words. D-O-N-T. Let him walk behind you. None of us spoke for several seconds. Paul looked at me. That's Daniel's handwriting? Yes. How do you know? I've seen his registration form. The writing matched. Not perfectly, but enough. We called the sheriff. We called the incident commander. We photographed everything. Then we continued. The tracks led toward a narrow ravine. The ravine was approximately 30 feet deep. At the bottom was a creek. We couldn't see the opposite side clearly because of dense timber. One of the search technicians raised his binoculars. There's somebody down there. Every person on the ridge turned. I looked through my binoculars. At first, I saw only trees. Then, I saw movement. A person, standing beside the creek, wearing a dark jacket. I lowered the binoculars. Daniel? The figure didn't move. Paul raised his radio. Daniel Mercer. This is search and rescue. If you can hear me, raise your hand. Nothing. Paul repeated himself. The figure raised one arm. We started down. The slope was dangerous. Loose rock, wet soil, dead branches. It took us nearly 20 minutes to reach the creek. When we got close enough to see the person's face, I knew it was Daniel. He looked thinner. His beard had grown out. His clothing was dirty. But it was him, alive. He was sitting beside the creek, his back against a tree. His eyes were open. He looked directly at me. "Where's the other one?" I said. "What other one?" Daniel looked past me, into the trees. Then he said something I still don't like remembering. "He'll be here soon." We checked him medically. He was severely dehydrated but stable. His feet were badly damaged. His blood sugar was low. He had lost approximately 20 pounds. But his injuries weren't consistent with an 11-day ordeal. There were no major wounds, no broken bones, no severe infection, no obvious exposure injuries. He should have been in worse condition, much worse. When the medic asked him what he had been eating, Daniel said berries, water, and food from his original pack. His backpack was still with him. Inside were 2 days of food, untouched. The food wrappers were dry. The compass was intact. The map was folded. His satellite communicator was there. Its battery was nearly full. I remember staring at it. "Daniel." He looked at me. "Why didn't you use this?" I did. "There are no messages. I wasn't trying to send messages. What were you doing?" He looked toward the trees. "Listening." I asked him what he meant. He didn't answer. Instead, he asked whether we'd found his jacket. I told him we had. He closed his eyes. "That's good." "Why?" "Because he was wearing it." Nobody spoke. The medic told me to stop questioning him. We started preparing him for evacuation. The helicopter couldn't land in the ravine, so we'd have to carry him approximately half a mile to a clearing. Before we moved him, I asked one final question. "Daniel, who was with you?" He looked at me. For the first time since we'd found him, he looked genuinely frightened. "I don't know." "Did you know him before?" "No." "What did he look like?" Daniel swallowed. "I never saw his face." "Then how do you know there was someone there?" He pointed toward the forest. He walked behind me. "How long?" Daniel looked down at his hands. "Most of the time." "Most of the 11 days?" "No." He paused. "Most of the 11 days I remember." That answer stayed with me, because it meant there were parts he didn't remember. And those missing hours became the center of the investigation. We carried Daniel out before sunset. He was transported to the county hospital. That should have been the end of the wilderness search. It wasn't. Because the moment Daniel was medically stable, detectives began interviewing him. And his story changed. Not dramatically, just enough. The first interview was conducted Tuesday morning. I wasn't in the room. I read the transcript later. Daniel told investigators that he had become lost during the first afternoon. He said he followed what he believed was the correct trail. Then he noticed a person behind him. At first, he assumed it was another hiker. He called out. The person didn't answer. Daniel continued walking. The footsteps continued. He turned around. Nobody was there. He waited. Nothing. Then he heard footsteps behind him again. That happened repeatedly. Daniel said he eventually stopped turning around. He decided that whoever was behind him would either catch up or leave. Neither happened. The footsteps maintained the same distance, always behind him, never closer, never farther away, approximately 15 to 20 yards. That was when he began leaving markers. A strip of orange cloth, a scratch on a tree, a stone placed upright. Anything he could use to determine whether he was walking in circles. The markers disappeared. Not every time, but often enough. He said the worst part wasn't that someone followed him, it was that the person began copying him. When Daniel stopped, the footsteps stopped. When Daniel started, the footsteps started. When Daniel moved left, the footsteps shifted left. When he moved right, they shifted right. Eventually Daniel tested it. He walked backward. The footsteps behind him also changed. Daniel said he heard a second set of footsteps ahead. He stopped. Both stopped. That's when he understood something was wrong. There wasn't one person behind him. There were two. At least, that's what he believed. He told detectives that he spent the next several days trying to reach open ground. Each time he thought he was leaving the area, the terrain changed. A trail that should have taken him south brought him north. A creek he remembered crossing appeared again. A rock formation he had already passed showed up ahead. He started marking trees. The marks returned, sometimes on trees he hadn't touched, sometimes upside down. Then came the part detectives initially considered evidence of severe sleep deprivation. Daniel said he began hearing voices, not conversations, short statements, always from behind him. The first one was, "Keep walking." The second, "You're almost there." The third, "Don't turn around." He said the voice sounded like his own. That detail would have been easy to dismiss, until investigators found his recording device. Daniel carried a small handheld audio recorder for wildlife observations. He had forgotten about it when he was found. The battery was dead. The device was recovered from his backpack. Detectives eventually extracted the audio. There were hours of recordings. Most contained nothing but wind, rain, footsteps, and Daniel breathing. But there were 3 recordings that nobody could explain. The first was made on the 4th day. At 2:13 a.m., Daniel's voice could be heard whispering, "I know you're there." There was a pause. Then another voice answered, "Keep walking." It sounded exactly like Daniel. Not similar, not vaguely similar. According to the audio technician, the voice characteristics were consistent with Daniel's own. The second recording was made approximately 6 hours later. Daniel said, "Who are you?" The voice replied, "You already know." The third recording was made on the 7th day. Daniel sounded exhausted. He said, "I can't keep doing this." Then the other voice said, "You don't have to." After that, there was approximately 37 seconds of silence. Then Daniel screamed. The recording ended. Detectives asked him what happened. He said he didn't remember. "That was the first time I became convinced that the missing hours mattered." The second thing that bothered me was the handwriting. Investigators photographed every note Daniel had made. There were 17 separate entries. Some were written normally. Others were written backward. Not mirror writing exactly, just reversed in sections. Words appeared in the wrong order. Sentences stopped halfway through. One note contained only a series of times. 213, 213, 213, 213, 213. The times were separated by different dates. At first, investigators assumed Daniel had become fixated on a recurring sound. Then someone checked the audio recordings. Every time the strange voice appeared, the timestamp was 213, not approximately. Exactly 213. The search team returned to the wilderness 3 days later. I went with them. Our objective was simple: find the place where Daniel had spent most of his missing time. We had his GPS history from a separate device he carried. The data was incomplete, but there was a pattern. His recorded positions formed a rough loop, a narrow loop approximately 2 miles long. We plotted the points. The loop wasn't random. It circled the abandoned forestry station 3 times. Daniel had walked past the station repeatedly without realizing it. The final track ended near the ravine where we found him. We searched the area again. This time we found something beneath the leaves. A tent. Not Daniel's. An old canvas shelter. It had been constructed between 2 trees. Inside was a sleeping bag, empty food containers, a rusted lantern, a metal cup, and a photograph. The photograph was old, maybe 20 years, maybe 30. The image showed a group of 4 forestry workers standing beside the abandoned station, 3 men, 1 woman. On the back was a date, October 17th, 1994. Below it, someone had written, "Last inspection before closure." We compared the photograph with district records. The station had been closed in November 1994. The official reason was structural deterioration and lack of operational need, nothing unusual. But one of the 4 people in the photograph had never been listed in the employee records. His face had been scratched away. Not blurred, not damaged by age. Scratched. Someone had deliberately removed it. Paul recognized the other 3. The woman had been a forestry technician. One of the men was a district engineer. The third was a seasonal ranger. The 4th remained unidentified. We searched archived documents. There was no mention of him. But there was a maintenance log from October 18th. The entry was brief. Inspection completed. Personnel accounted for. That phrase became important. Personnel accounted for, because they weren't. 1 person from the photograph was missing from the records. And almost 30 years later, Daniel had encountered something in exactly the same area. We returned to the old station. I stood where the photograph had been taken. Paul was beside me. "Something happened here," I said. He nodded. "What?" "I don't know." We searched the foundation again. Under a collapsed section of concrete, we found a metal box. Inside were old documents. Most were destroyed by moisture, but 1 page was readable. It was a handwritten map. The map showed the station, the service road, the creek, and a circle drawn around the ravine. Beside the circle were 3 words, "Do not follow him." The handwriting was not Daniel's. We photographed the page. Then Paul said something that made me look up. "Ethan." He was staring at the tree line. "What?" "Listen, I heard nothing at first. Then 3 footsteps. Crunch, 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 crunch. Somewhere beyond the trees. We waited. Another 3. Closer. Crunch, 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 crunch." Paul raised his rifle. The rest of the team moved together. Nobody spoke. The sound stopped. Then we heard a voice. It was faint. Almost too faint to understand. "Keep walking," I recognized the voice. It was Daniel's. But Daniel was in a hospital 200 miles away. At least, that's what we believed. We left the area immediately. The official report described the sound as unidentified vocalization. The investigation remained open for several months. Daniel recovered physically. He never returned to hiking. He refused to discuss the recordings publicly. He also refused to return to the wilderness. I spoke with him once. Only once. It was about 6 months after the search. He called me unexpectedly. His voice sounded normal, calm. He asked whether we still had the photograph from the old station. I said yes. He asked whether the damaged face had ever been identified. I told him no. He was silent. Then he said, "I think I know who it was." I asked him who. Daniel said, "It was me." I didn't understand. He told me that during the missing days, he had found the old photograph. He remembered seeing it. He remembered touching it. He remembered thinking that the scratched-out person looked familiar. But he had never seen his own face in it. Then he said something else. "I didn't tell the detectives everything." "What didn't you tell them?" "I did see him." "Who?" "The man behind me." I asked what he looked like. Daniel said, "He looked exactly like me." I thought he was describing the voice. He wasn't. Daniel told me that on the 8th night, he had finally turned around. He said the person was standing approximately 20 feet away, wearing Daniel's orange rain jacket. The same jacket we had found hanging in the tree. The person had Daniel's face. Daniel said he couldn't move. The other man didn't approach. He simply pointed toward the trail. Then he said, "You left me here." Daniel asked what he meant. The man smiled and said, "You always do." I didn't know what to say. Daniel continued, "He said he had turned away. He ran. He didn't look back. And sometime after that, he lost consciousness. When he woke, he was beside the creek, the same place we found him. I asked him why he hadn't told investigators. He said, because I didn't know if I was supposed to be the one who came back." That sentence ended the conversation. I never heard from him again. 3 years passed. I left search and rescue. I moved to another county. I stopped thinking about Daniel. Or, at least, I tried. Then, last winter, I received an email from the county records office. They were digitizing old search files. They had found a photograph that belonged to the Mercer case. Would I be willing to identify the location? The photograph was taken by one of our search technicians on the day we found Daniel. It showed the ravine. Daniel was visible in the lower left corner. The search team stood behind him. The photograph looked normal, until I zoomed in. There was something between the trees, a person, approximately 20 yards behind the search team. At first, I thought it was Paul, but Paul was standing beside me. The figure was wearing an orange rain jacket. I enlarged the image. The face was visible. It was Daniel, exactly as he looked when we found him. Same beard, same clothing, same expression. The problem was the photograph's timestamp. It had been taken at 3:42 p.m. We found Daniel at 3:17. By 3:42, he was already halfway to the evacuation point. He was nowhere near the trees in the photograph. I checked the original file. No editing, no duplicate image, no evidence of manipulation. I sent it to a forensic imaging specialist. He couldn't explain it. Then I noticed something else. At the bottom of the photograph, near the creek, there were footprints. 2 sets. One belonged to the search team. The other did not. The unfamiliar prints led toward the trees and stopped beside the figure. I printed the photograph. I keep it in a drawer. I don't show it to people anymore. Not because I'm afraid they'll think it's fake. I'm afraid someone will recognize the person. Because 6 months after I received that photograph, I got another email. No subject, no message. Just one attachment. A photograph. It showed the old forestry station. The image looked like it had been taken recently. There was snow on the ground. The station foundation was visible. And beside it stood a man wearing an orange rain jacket. His face was turned away from the camera. On the back of the photograph was a handwritten sentence. "You never found the one who came back." I don't know who sent it. I don't know where the photograph was taken. And I don't know whether Daniel Mercer is still alive. The last official record I have of him is from a medical follow-up 8 months after the search. He was alive. He was living in another state. He had stopped hiking. He had stopped using satellite communicators. And, according to the report, he had developed one unusual habit. He never walked behind another person. Not in parking lots, not on sidewalks, not inside buildings. If someone walked behind him, Daniel would stop and let them pass. I used to think that was a trauma response. Now I'm not sure. Because when I look at that photograph from the ravine, I notice something I didn't notice the first 100 times. Daniel isn't looking at the camera. He's looking at the person standing behind the search team. And the expression on his face isn't fear, it's recognition. I have spent most of my adult life believing that wilderness searches are about finding people. You follow tracks. You read terrain. You reconstruct decisions. You calculate how far a person could realistically travel. You search the places where a frightened or injured person would naturally go. And most of the time, that logic works. But there is one thing I learned from Daniel Mercer that isn't written in any search manual. Sometimes a missing person isn't trying to get home. Sometimes they're trying to stay ahead of something. And sometimes when you finally find them, the question isn't where they've been, it's what followed them back. I still have the map from the old forestry station, the one with the circle around the ravine. The paper is brittle now. The ink has faded. But there is one detail I never noticed until recently. The original map was dated October 17th, 1994, the same date as the photograph. The same date the unidentified forestry worker disappeared from the records. And in the lower corner, underneath the old handwritten warning, there is another line. It wasn't visible when we first found the map. Someone had written over it in pencil. The words are faint, but they're readable. Never search alone. I used to think that meant there was danger in the forest. Now I think it meant something else. I think it meant that if you ever hear footsteps behind you, you should make sure you know exactly how many people are walking with you. Because Daniel Mercer was found alive. That part of the story is true within the fictional case I've described. But according to the last photograph I received, he wasn't the only person who came out of those woods. And whoever came out with him never needed to be found. He only needed someone else to follow. I didn't tell anyone about the photograph. That wasn't because I believed it was dangerous. At least, that's what I told myself. The practical explanation was that I didn't know where it came from. And without knowing its origin, there was no responsible way to attach meaning to it. A photograph could be manipulated. A timestamp could be wrong. A person in the background could be someone who happened to resemble Daniel. Those were reasonable explanations. I had built my career on reasonable explanations. So I put the photograph in a folder, put the folder in a locked drawer, and went on with my life. For almost 4 months, nothing happened. Then I received a letter. It arrived at my house on a Tuesday morning in early March. There was no return address. The envelope was ordinary white paper, slightly bent along one corner. My name was handwritten on the front, not printed, handwritten. The handwriting looked familiar. I couldn't place it immediately. I opened the envelope at the kitchen table. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper. There were only 6 words. Stop looking for the second trail. I read it 3 times. Then I turned the paper over. Nothing. I checked the envelope again. Nothing. I called the county sheriff's office. They sent a deputy to collect it. I told him about the photograph. I didn't tell him everything. I showed him the original image and the letter. He photographed both. Then he asked me a question. Do you know anyone who might be trying to scare you? No. Anyone connected to the Mercer case? No. Anyone from search and rescue? No. He looked at the photograph. Could this be Daniel? Yes. Could it be somebody who looks like him? I suppose. He nodded. That was exactly the answer I expected. He took the letter. The investigation went nowhere. No fingerprints, no useful DNA. No surveillance footage showing who had placed the envelope in my mailbox. And because no explicit threat had been made, there wasn't much the department could do. I returned to my normal routine for 3 weeks. Then I started noticing the footsteps. The first time was outside a grocery store. It was evening. I had parked near the far end of the lot because the closer spaces were full. I walked toward my truck. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Normal footsteps. Nothing unusual. I kept walking. The footsteps continued. I stopped. They stopped. I waited. Nothing. I turned. The parking lot was empty behind me. There was a shopping cart near the curb. A street light. 3 parked cars. Nobody. I laughed at myself. That was the first time. The second happened at work. I was walking through the hallway of the emergency management building when I heard someone behind me. 3 steps. Then silence. I turned. Empty hallway. The third time was different. I was driving. I had just turned onto a county road when I heard 3 knocks from somewhere behind me. I looked in the rearview mirror. Nothing. 3 more knocks. I pulled over. The road was empty. I got out of the vehicle. There was no explanation. The sound had seemed to come from inside the rear cargo area. I opened it. Nothing. I closed the door. Then I noticed something on the rear window. A fingerprint. From the inside. I stared at it. It was larger than mine. I wiped it away. I didn't tell anyone. That was my mistake. Because once you start accepting unexplained things as coincidences, you become very good at ignoring patterns. A week later, I received another photograph. This one wasn't of the forest. It was of me. I was standing outside the emergency management building. The photograph had been taken from across the street. I was holding a coffee. I knew the exact morning. The image was time-stamped. 7:42 a.m. The timestamp was correct. The photograph was real. Whoever had taken it had been watching me. I reported it immediately. This time, detectives took it seriously. They checked nearby businesses, traffic cameras, parking cameras, building security. Nothing. The photographer had chosen a position between 2 buildings where no camera had a clear view. It was deliberate. A detective asked me whether I had returned to the Granite Creek area. I said no. He asked whether I'd contacted Daniel. I said no. Then he asked something that made me uncomfortable. Did you ever tell Daniel about the second set of footprints? No. Why not? I assumed he knew. The detective looked at me. You assumed the missing man knew about footprints that were found before we located him? I realized how strange that sounded. I told him the truth. I hadn't thought about it that way. We had found the prints. Then we found Daniel. We had assumed they were connected. But Daniel had never mentioned footprints. Not once. I went home that night and opened the old case files. I read every interview, every report, every field note. Then I found something. A search log from the 5th day. The entry was written by one of our volunteers. 2 sets of tracks observed near north drainage. One appears to match missing subject. Second set unclear. I kept reading. The next line said, tracks were photographed. I searched the archive. There were no photographs attached. I called the former incident commander. He didn't remember them. I called the volunteer. He didn't answer. I tried again the following morning. His wife picked up. I identified myself. There was a long silence. Then she said, he doesn't talk about that search. Why? I don't know. Can I speak with him? Another silence. No. She hung up. That should have ended my curiosity. Instead, it made it worse. I began reconstructing the search from memory, not the official report. My memory, the places we searched, the people who were there, the decisions we made, and I realized something. We had never actually searched the location where Daniel's footprints began. We had searched the trail, we had searched the ridge, we had searched the drainage, but the exact place where the second set of prints appeared had been marked as low priority because the terrain was exposed rock. We had followed Daniel's tracks uphill. The other tracks led downhill. We assumed they belonged to someone else. What if they didn't? What if both sets belonged to Daniel? That possibility seemed absurd. Until I remembered the photograph. The man in the orange jacket. The man standing behind the search team. Daniel. Maybe the second person wasn't following Daniel. Maybe Daniel was following him. I drove to the county records office the next morning. The old search files were stored in a basement archive. I asked for every document connected to the Mercer case. The clerk brought me 7 boxes. I spent 6 hours going through them. At the bottom of the 4th box, I found a field notebook. It belonged to Paul Haskins. The pages were filled with coordinates, times, weather conditions, and search observations. I turned to the 5th day. There was a note. Tracks do not make sense. Underneath it, same tread pattern found in 3 locations. Then, could be search personnel. The next line was crossed out. I held the page under the desk lamp. The crossed out sentence was still partially visible. Could be same person. I turned the page. There was a drawing. A rough map of the search area. Paul had marked the locations where the footprints were found. They formed a line. Not a random line. A loop. The same loop we later discovered in Daniel's GPS data. I stared at it. Then I noticed something else. The loop wasn't centered on the abandoned station. It was centered on the ravine. The exact place where we found Daniel. I photographed the page. Then I called Paul. He answered on the 2nd attempt. "Where are you?" I told him. He went quiet. "What did you find?" "Your notebook." Another silence. "You shouldn't have opened that." "Why?" "Because I thought we destroyed it." "Why would you destroy it?" He didn't answer. I asked again. "Paul, what happened during that search?" He finally said, "I saw him." "Daniel?" "No." "Then who?" Paul's voice dropped. "The other one." I didn't speak. He continued, "I saw him on the 4th day." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't know what I saw." "You wrote about it." "I wrote about footprints." "You crossed out same person." I was trying to make myself believe that. "Believe what?" "That there was only one." Paul stopped. Then he said, "You need to leave the records office." "Why?" "Because if you found the notebook, somebody else knows you found it." The call ended. I looked around the basement. Rows of shelves, concrete walls, a fluorescent light buzzing above me. Nothing else. Then I heard footsteps. 3. Behind the door. I froze. The sound stopped. I waited. Nothing. I walked to the basement entrance. The door was closed. I opened it. The hallway was empty. I went back inside. The notebook was still on the table, but the page I had been reading was gone. Not torn. Gone. The entire sheet had been removed from the binding. I looked through the notebook. The previous page was intact. The next page was intact. Only that page was missing. I reported it. Nobody believed me. Not fully. They believed the page was missing. They didn't believe anyone had taken it. The archive had cameras. There was no footage of anyone entering the basement after me. The clerk had been upstairs the entire time. No alarm had been triggered. The notebook had been on the table when I arrived, and when I left, the page was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. At 2:13 a.m., my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. Nobody spoke. I could hear breathing. Slow. Controlled. Then a voice said, "You're looking in the wrong direction." I recognized it. Daniel's voice. I hung up. The phone rang again. I didn't answer. It rang a third time, then stopped. I checked the call history. The number was unavailable. The next morning, I called the detective handling the case. He came to my house. I played the recording. He listened twice. Then he asked, "Are you sure this isn't an old recording?" "No. Could someone have altered it?" "I don't know." He didn't respond. Instead, he asked, "What does Daniel sound like now?" "I haven't spoken to him in years." "Why?" "Because after the case, he stopped communicating with everyone involved." The detective looked at me. "That's not entirely true." He handed me a file. Daniel had contacted the sheriff's office 2 years after the original search. The report was short. Daniel had called from another state. He asked whether the Granite Creek search records were still accessible. The dispatcher asked why. Daniel said, "I need to know if you found another person." The dispatcher asked him to explain. Daniel hung up. No follow-up. I stared at the report. "When was this?" 2 years ago. "Why wasn't I told?" "You weren't involved anymore." "Fair enough." But there was another document. A handwritten note attached to the report. The dispatcher had written, "Caller sounded frightened. Asked whether search teams had located the man in orange." I felt something tighten in my chest. I asked the detective, "Did anyone contact Daniel after that?" "No." "Where is he now?" "We don't know." That answer changed everything. Daniel Mercer had disappeared again, not officially. There was no missing person report, no abandoned vehicle, no emergency. He had simply stopped appearing in the places where people expected him to be. The detective made some calls. We learned that Daniel had sold his house, closed his bank account, moved twice. His last known address was a small town in Oregon. We found a rental agreement. He had left 6 months earlier, no forwarding address. His landlord remembered one thing. Daniel had asked whether the property had a rear entrance. He also asked whether anyone could access the house without being seen from the road. The landlord thought he was paranoid. I didn't. We drove to Oregon. I went with the detective. It took 2 days. The house was empty. Inside, everything had been cleaned. Too clean. No photographs. No personal documents. No furniture except a table and 2 chairs. On the kitchen wall was a hand-drawn map. I recognized it immediately. Granite Creek. The map showed the old station, the ravine, and a second location, approximately 4 miles east. There was a circle around it. Beside the circle were 3 words. "Where he waits." We searched the house, nothing else. Then the detective found something beneath the floorboard in the bedroom, a small metal box. Inside were dozens of photographs. Most showed wilderness locations. Some showed Daniel, some showed me, some showed Paul. There were photographs from the original search, photographs I had never seen, and in several of them, the same figure appeared in the background. Orange jacket, same height, same posture, same face. Daniel. The detective spread the photographs across the floor. We counted 17. Then we noticed something. The photographs weren't arranged chronologically. They were arranged by distance. Each image brought the figure closer to the camera. In the first, he was barely visible. In the second, he was farther down the trail. In the third, he stood beside a tree. In the fourth, he was approximately 50 yards away. The last photograph showed him standing directly behind the photographer. We couldn't see the photographer's face, but we could see the photographer's reflection in a vehicle window. It was Daniel. The photograph had been taken after Daniel disappeared. The detective looked at me. "Who took these?" I said. "I think Daniel did." "Then who's taking the photographs of Daniel?" I didn't have an answer. That night we stayed in a motel. Neither of us slept much. At 2:13 a.m., someone knocked on the door. 3 times. The detective reached for his weapon. We waited. Another 3 knocks. He moved toward the door. I grabbed his arm. "Don't." He looked at me. Why? I couldn't explain. I just knew. The knocking stopped. Then a voice came from the hallway. "Ethan?" It was Daniel. The detective looked at me. I shook my head. The voice came again. "Ethan, open the door." It sounded exactly like him. Then the voice changed. Not gradually. Instantly. It became mine. "Ethan, open the door." The detective stepped back. We waited. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. Eventually we checked the hallway. Empty. But there were wet footprints outside our room. They started at the elevator. They came toward our door. And stopped. There were no footprints leading away. The detective photographed them. Then he said, "We're leaving." We checked out before sunrise. On the drive home, he told me something. He had been involved in another missing person case 5 years earlier. Different county, different state, same pattern. A hiker disappeared. He was found 9 days later, alive. He claimed someone had followed him. The detective had dismissed it as trauma. But there was a photograph. A search photograph. Someone in the background, wearing the missing man's clothes. The case had been closed. The missing man moved away. The detective never connected it to Daniel until now. I asked whether there had been other cases. He said he didn't know. So we started searching. Old reports, local newspapers, archived search logs. Anything involving hikers found alive after prolonged disappearances. We found 6 cases. Then 11. Then 23. Different states, different decades, different circumstances, but the details repeated. A missing person disappeared alone. Search teams found unexplained footprints. The person was eventually located alive. They claimed someone had followed them. They couldn't describe the person's face. They sometimes heard their own voice. And in several cases, search photographs contained a second figure. Always behind the missing person. Always wearing something associated with them. A jacket, a hat, a backpack, a distinctive shirt. One case from Colorado involved a woman who disappeared for 4 days. She returned wearing the same clothes she had left in. Her family noticed something strange. She had a second pair of hiking boots, not hers. They were in her car. Nobody knew where they came from. Another case from Washington involved a hunter who disappeared for 6 days. When he returned, he insisted that someone had been walking behind him. His brother laughed. Then the hunter asked, "Did you find the other boot?" There had only been 1 pair. The brother checked. There were 2. The second boot was found inside the hunter's house. No one knew how it got there. We kept digging. Eventually, we found the earliest case. It was from 1978. A 19-year-old college student disappeared during a solo hike in northern Idaho. He returned 8 days later. His first words were, "There's someone still out there." He refused to explain. 3 days later, he disappeared again. This time, he was never found. There was 1 photograph in the file, a trail. The missing student was standing in the distance. Behind him was another person. The image was badly damaged, but the second figure was wearing the student's backpack. The report described it as an artifact. We didn't think it was. The detective called me one night. He had found something, a pattern in the dates. The disappearances weren't random. They occurred approximately every 6 to 9 years. Different regions, different people. But the locations shared one characteristic. Each had an abandoned forestry, mining, or utility structure nearby, and each missing person had walked past it. The structures were different. The behavior was the same. The person disappeared, returned, and later changed their behavior. Some stopped hiking, some moved. Some became obsessed with being followed. 2 disappeared again. 1 died under circumstances officially classified as accidental. The detective believed there was a connection. I wasn't sure. But then we found the 1994 file, the old forestry station, the unidentified worker, the missing personnel record, and Daniel. The connection was undeniable. There had been someone else in the woods before Daniel. Maybe more than one. We contacted the surviving relatives of the forestry workers. One family agreed to speak with us. The daughter of the female technician from the photograph was living in Washington. She remembered the station. She remembered her mother coming home after the final inspection. She remembered that her mother wouldn't talk about it. But she remembered one sentence. Her mother had said, "If you see him twice, you're already too late." The daughter thought it was about a coworker. She didn't know which one. Then she showed us a box of old belongings. Inside was a cassette tape. We played it. The recording was from October 18th, 1994. The day after the photograph. The woman's voice sounded tired. She was speaking to someone. We could hear another person in the background. Her voice said, "We checked the building." Pause. "No, I know." Another pause. "I saw him." The other person asked, "Where?" She answered, "Behind the station." Then the tape became distorted. The last clear sentence was, "He wasn't supposed to be there." Then a man's voice said, "You're not supposed to see him." The recording ended. We digitized the tape. The audio specialist cleaned the distortion. The man's voice became clearer. It was one of the 3 documented forestry workers. He had died in 2003. We couldn't identify the unidentified 4th person, but the daughter remembered something else. Her mother had kept a second photograph, a photograph nobody had ever found. She said it showed the 4 workers at the station, but there was something strange about it. The 4th person wasn't standing with them. He was behind them. The daughter searched her mother's belongings. She found the photograph. We looked at it. The same 4 people, same date, same station. But the unidentified man wasn't wearing an orange jacket. He was wearing Daniel's jacket. The photograph was from 1994. Daniel was 12 years old. He had never been to Montana, according to his family. At least, that's what they believed. We contacted Daniel's sister. She told us something neither of us expected. Daniel had been to Montana as a child, once. He was 12. His father had taken him camping. She couldn't remember the exact location, but she remembered a photograph. Daniel standing beside a lake, wearing an orange jacket. The same jacket. The same one later found hanging from the tree. The detective asked where the photograph was. She said, "Daniel destroyed it." Why? He said there was someone in the background. We asked what the person looked like. She said, "Daniel." That was the moment the entire story changed. The man wasn't copying Daniel. Daniel had been copying him. Or perhaps the process had started long before the 2016 disappearance. Maybe Daniel had seen something when he was 12. Maybe he had forgotten. Maybe the forest hadn't forgotten. We returned to Montana. This time, we didn't go alone. We brought a larger team. ground-penetrating radar, thermal equipment, mapping drones, evidence technicians. The goal was to inspect the old station and the ravine systematically. We weren't looking for a creature. We weren't looking for ghosts. We were looking for a physical explanation, a hidden structure, an old tunnel, a cave, anything that could explain how someone could move through the area without being seen. The old station had one unusual feature: a concrete foundation extending approximately 20 feet beneath the ground. We had assumed it was a storage basement. It wasn't. The entrance was hidden beneath a slab. Inside was a narrow tunnel. The tunnel ran beneath the ridge, approximately 400 yards. At the end was another room. Inside that room were dozens of objects: backpacks, boots, jackets, photographs, maps, personal belongings, not ancient, not historical, modern. Some belonged to missing hikers. We found identification cards, keys, wallets, pieces of clothing, a camera, a satellite communicator, and a small plastic container filled with handwritten notes. Each note contained a name. Some were crossed out, some weren't. Daniel's name was there, so was mine. Paul's was there, the detective's name was there, and beneath our names was a date. The date was 3 days in the future. We had no idea who had written it. We left the tunnel immediately. The authorities sealed the entrance. An investigation followed, but the official explanation was never released publicly. The county described the discovery as an abandoned underground storage facility, nothing more. The belongings were cataloged. Some were matched to missing person cases. Others couldn't be identified. The photographs were taken as evidence. The notes were secured. The tunnel was sealed with concrete. At least, that's what I was told. 6 months later, I received another photograph. It showed the sealed entrance. The concrete was still wet. A person stood beside it, wearing an orange jacket. The photograph had been taken from inside the tunnel. On the back was another sentence: "You sealed the wrong door." I stopped looking for answers after that. Not because I believed the mystery was solved, because I realized something more important. The investigation itself might have been part of the pattern. Every search created new evidence. Every attempt to understand it led someone deeper into the same structure. The missing people weren't simply disappearing. They were being drawn toward a place, and the searchers followed. I left the field completely. I stopped working wilderness cases. I don't carry a compass anymore. I don't hike. I don't camp. And I never walk alone in a forest. But there is one thing I still do. Whenever I hear footsteps behind me, I count them. Not the number of steps, the number of people. Because sometimes the footsteps aren't following you. Sometimes they're waiting for you to turn around. The last time I heard them was 6 months ago. I was at home. It was 2:13 in the morning. 3 footsteps sounded in the hallway. I was alone. I knew that. I had checked the doors, the windows, the locks. I stayed in bed. The footsteps stopped outside my bedroom. Then my phone vibrated. Unknown number, 1 message, a photograph. I opened it. It showed a forest. I recognized it immediately. Granite Creek. The image was taken from the old station. At the edge of the frame stood Daniel Mercer. Older, thinner, still wearing orange. He was facing the camera. Behind him stood another man. Same height, same face, same jacket. And behind that man was another, and another. There were 7 figures in the photograph, all wearing orange, all with Daniel's face. The message beneath the photograph contained only 1 sentence: he was never alone. I deleted it. I deleted every copy of the photograph. I blocked the number. Then I sat awake until sunrise. At 6:41, There was a knock on my front door. 3 times. I didn't move. A voice came from the other side. "Ethan?" I knew that voice. It was mine. I stayed silent. The voice spoke again. "You can stop looking now." Then the footsteps moved away. I heard them cross the porch. Then the driveway. Then the road. I waited 10 minutes before checking. There was nobody outside, but on the porch, directly in front of the door, was a single object. An orange rain jacket. It was wet. The same jacket we had found hanging in the tree years earlier. I didn't touch it. I called the police. They came. They photographed it. They took it as evidence. The next day, the detective called me. He sounded different, tired. He said they had tested the jacket. The fabric was old. The zipper was corroded. There was dirt embedded in the seams. And inside the collar was a label. A name. D. Mercer. I asked whether it could have been Daniel's original jacket. The detective said no. The original jacket had been destroyed after evidence processing. This one had a different manufacturing tag. It had been produced 2 years after Daniel disappeared. I asked him what he thought that meant. He didn't answer. Instead, he said, "You remember the list from the underground room?" "Yes." "The names?" "Yes." "Your name was crossed out." I felt a strange relief. Then he continued, "Mine wasn't." The call ended. I never spoke to him again. His body was found 3 months later. Officially, it was a hiking accident. He had gone into the mountains alone. His vehicle was found at a trailhead. His body was located 2 days later near a creek. The report said he had fallen. I read the report. I looked at the photographs. There was nothing unusual, except one thing. His footprints led toward the creek. Another set led behind him. The second set stopped exactly where his own footprints began. I don't know what happened to Daniel Mercer. I don't know who the man in the orange jacket was. I don't know whether the underground room existed before 1994 or whether someone built it later. I don't know how the photographs were taken. I don't know how someone could have known where I lived. And I don't know why the same voice keeps appearing in recordings separated by decades. There are explanations for some of it. There always are. Someone could have impersonated Daniel. Someone could have planted photographs. Someone could have manipulated records. Someone could have followed us. Someone could have built the tunnel. Someone could have created the legend. But there is one detail I can't explain. The final photograph I received contained 7 versions of Daniel. We only found 6 names in the underground room. Daniel, me, Paul, the detective, and 2 unidentified hikers. 6, but there were 7 figures, which means there was one more person, or one more version. And I don't know whose face it had, because the 7th figure was standing outside the frame. Only his shadow was visible. The shadow was facing the camera. The figure wasn't. That photograph is gone now. At least I think it is, because sometimes, late at night, when I walk through my house, I hear footsteps behind me, 3 at a time, never more, never fewer. And I don't turn around. I don't need to. I learned something from Daniel. If you hear someone walking behind you, the worst mistake isn't turning around. The worst mistake is believing that you're the person they're following. Because Daniel wasn't found alone. He was found with the thing that had been walking behind him. And after all these years, I finally understand what he meant when he asked the paramedic that morning whether they had found the other man. He wasn't asking whether we had found someone else in the woods. He was asking whether we had found the man who had followed him out We hadn't. We never did. And somewhere, according to the last photograph, he is still walking, still wearing orange, still staying 20 yards behind, still waiting for someone to stop. And if the pattern is real, the person he's following next won't know they've been chosen until they hear the footsteps. 3 steps, then silence, then 3 more, always behind, never closer. Until one day, someone turns around and realizes the person standing there has been wearing their face for a very long time. The clock changed to midnight. 11:59 disappeared. 12 o'clock appeared, and nothing happened. No footsteps, no voice, no knock at the door. For several seconds, I actually felt relieved. Then my phone vibrated. 1 notification. Unknown device connected. I stared at the screen. My phone had no Bluetooth devices connected. I checked the settings. Nothing. Then another notification appeared. Audio recorder connected. I hadn't connected anything. The old cassette recorder was sitting on my desk. I walked toward it slowly. The tape wasn't inside. I had thrown it away. I was certain of that. But now the recorder was playing. The speaker crackled. Then I heard breathing. My breathing, not a recording of it. My actual breathing. The device was somehow transmitting the sound of me standing in the room. I stopped. The breathing continued. Then the recorder clicked. A voice whispered, "Turn around." I didn't. The voice repeated itself. Turn around. I stepped backward. The bedroom door was still open. The hallway beyond it was dark. I could see nothing. Then the recorder spoke again. This time, it wasn't my voice. It was Daniel's. "Ethan, don't let him see you." I froze. "Who?" Silence. Then, me. The recorder clicked off. I stood there for several seconds. Then, I heard movement from the hallway. Slow. Bare feet against hardwood. 1 step. Pause. Another. Pause. Then 3 steps in rapid succession. I closed the bedroom door. The footsteps stopped immediately. I locked it. For the next hour, nothing happened. At approximately 1:17 a.m., I heard a vehicle outside. I looked through the curtains. A dark SUV was parked across the street. Engine running. Headlights off. Someone was sitting inside. I couldn't see the driver. I called the police. While I waited, the SUV pulled away. I watched it disappear around the corner. A patrol car arrived 15 minutes later. The officer checked the street. No vehicle. No footprints. No evidence. He asked whether I wanted him to stay. I said yes. He parked outside my house. For the first time that night, I felt safe. That feeling lasted until 2:13. At exactly 2:13 a.m., the patrol car's headlights turned on, then off, then on again. 3 times. I walked to the window. The officer was sitting inside. His head was tilted slightly to one side. I couldn't see his face. I picked up my phone. I was about to call him when he stepped out of the vehicle. He walked toward my house. Slowly, I opened the front door. "Officer?" He didn't answer. He stopped, halfway up the driveway. Then he looked at me. His face was pale. "Mr. Cole?" "Yes." He raised his hand. There was something in it. A photograph. "Where did you get that?" He didn't answer. He walked closer. Then I saw the photograph. It was the same image I had received earlier. Granite Creek Trailhead. Daniel standing beside the sign. Orange jacket. The date, August 20th, 2026. But there was something different. The photograph the officer held had another person in the background. Me. I was standing behind Daniel, wearing the same orange jacket. The officer looked at me. "Have you ever been there?" "Yes." "When?" "Years ago." He looked down at the photograph. "Then why are you in this?" I had no answer. He turned the photograph over. There was writing on the back. The officer read it silently. Then his expression changed. "What does it say?" He handed it to me. 3 words. He came back. I looked up. "Who?" The officer was staring over my shoulder. I didn't turn. He whispered, "Don't." The footsteps began behind me. 3. Slow, measured. The officer reached for his weapon. "Inside," he said. I stepped backward. He entered the house. We closed the door. The footsteps stopped. Then came a knock. 3 times. The officer looked at me. "Do you have another exit?" "Kitchen. Go." We moved through the house. The back door opened into the yard. The officer stepped outside first. He looked around. Clear. I followed. We moved toward the street. Then I heard the voice. "Ethan." I stopped. The officer grabbed my arm. "Don't answer." The voice came again. "Ethan." This time, it sounded like the officer. He looked at me. His face had gone completely white. "That's not me." I believed him. We ran. We reached his vehicle. He unlocked the doors. We got inside. He started the engine. As we pulled away, I looked into the rearview mirror. Someone was standing in my driveway. Orange jacket. Daniel's face. The figure raised one hand, not waving, pointing toward me. The officer accelerated. We drove for 20 minutes without speaking. Then he said, "I know where we've seen this before." I looked at him. "What? The old cases? What about them? They weren't missing hikers. What were they?" He shook his head. "I don't know yet." He pulled into a gas station, parked under the brightest lights. Then he called his supervisor. He explained what had happened. The supervisor told him to return to the station. He refused. Instead, he drove us to the County Emergency Operations Center. The building was empty at that hour. We entered through a side door. The officer locked it behind us. Then he took me into the records room. He pulled out an old box. "What's this?" "Cases from before the modern database." He opened it. Inside were missing person reports. Hundreds. He sorted through them, then stopped. "Look." He handed me a report. The name was Daniel Mercer, but the date was wrong. 1973. I stared at it. This isn't Daniel. No. The photograph attached to the report showed a 19-year-old man. Same facial structure, same eyes, same name, different person. The report described him as a forestry worker who disappeared near a remote station. He was never found. The officer opened another. 1948. Daniel Mercer. Another. 1921. Daniel Mercer. Another. 1896. Daniel Mercer. Different people. Same name. Same face. Different decades. I felt sick. That's impossible. I know. How many? He looked through the box. 37 Daniel Mercers, across more than a century. All connected to wilderness disappearances. All associated with abandoned utility structures. All reportedly followed by someone they couldn't identify. The oldest report was from 1887. There was no photograph, only a witness statement. The witness described a man who appeared behind a missing hiker. He wore the missing man's coat. That phrase had been underlined. I sat down. The officer looked at me. There's something else. He pulled out another folder. This one was newer. It was the report from my original case. Inside was a page I had never seen. A handwritten note. It contained a list. Daniel Mercer, Paul Haskins, Ethan Cole, and beneath our names, searcher, subject, returned. I asked what returned meant. The officer didn't know. Then he noticed something. At the bottom of the page was a fourth name. It had been crossed out. We could still read it, Daniel Mercer. But beneath it, someone had written, not the original. We looked at each other. The officer whispered, "What does that mean?" I didn't answer, because I suddenly remembered something. The first time I met Daniel, before the search, before the hospital, before the photographs, I had seen him at the trailhead. I had forgotten. On the morning the search began, I had reviewed the trailhead security footage. Daniel's truck arrived at 8:03. He got out. He opened the rear hatch. He put on his backpack. Then he walked toward the trail. But before entering the forest, he stopped. He turned around and looked directly at the security camera. I had always assumed he was checking his surroundings. Now I remembered something else. He had smiled. Not a normal smile. A brief, deliberate smile. As though he knew exactly where the camera was. And behind him, reflected in the truck window, was another person, wearing orange. I had seen it before. I had simply forgotten. The officer pulled up the archived footage. We watched it together. There was Daniel, then the reflection. The officer paused the video. He zoomed in. The figure's face was visible. It wasn't Daniel, it was me. I stared at the screen. "That isn't possible." The officer rewound. Played it again. Same result. The figure standing behind Daniel had my face, but I wasn't there. I was still at home that morning, according to my phone records, according to my wife, according to every piece of evidence we had. I had never been at the trailhead, but the footage showed me, standing behind Daniel, watching him enter the forest. The officer closed the laptop. "We're done." "Done with what?" "This." He stood. "We need to destroy the files." I looked at him. "You can't do that. You don't understand." "I understand exactly enough." "No." He shook his head. "You don't." He opened another file. Inside was a report from the previous sheriff, a handwritten statement. The sheriff had been involved in one of the earlier disappearances. He wrote, "We made the mistake of searching for the missing person." Underneath, the correct procedure is to identify the person who returns. Then, do not interview the returned subject alone. Then, do not allow returned subjects to view photographs of themselves. I stared at the last line. "Why?" The officer didn't answer. He opened a photograph. It showed a woman who had disappeared in 1999. She had been found alive. The photograph was taken in the hospital. She was sitting in bed. Her face was visible. Behind her, reflected in the window, was another version of herself. The woman in the photograph was looking directly at the reflection. She was smiling. The officer turned the photograph over. A note was written on the back. She said the reflection was asking her to switch places. I looked away. The officer closed the file. "We have to leave." "Where?" "Anywhere but here." We walked toward the exit. The building lights flickered, then went out. Emergency lights came on. Red, dim. The officer drew his weapon. "Stay behind me." We moved through the hallway. At the end was a glass door. Something stood behind it. A man. Orange jacket. We couldn't see his face. The officer raised his weapon. "Step away from the door." The man didn't move. The officer repeated himself. "Nothing." Then the man raised his hand. He pointed toward me. The emergency lights flickered. For half a second, the hallway went dark. When the lights returned, the man was gone. The door was still locked. There was no way around it. We opened the door. Outside was empty. The officer looked at me. "We're not staying." We drove until sunrise. Neither of us spoke. At 6:03 a.m., his phone rang. He answered. The voice on the other end said, "You brought him back." The officer looked at me. "Who?" The voice replied, "Ethan." The call ended. I didn't understand. Then I saw the dashboard clock. 6:03. The date had changed. August 21st. The day written beneath my name in the underground room. The officer stopped the vehicle. He looked at me. "I think we made a mistake." "What?" "We shouldn't have left the building." "Why?" He pointed behind me. I looked into the rearview mirror. There was someone sitting in the back seat. Orange jacket. Daniel's face. But the back seat had been empty when we left. I turned. Nothing. The officer slammed the brakes. I heard a voice directly beside my ear. "Keep walking." I turned. Nobody was there. The officer stared at me. Then he said, "Get out." "What?" "Get out of the car." We both exited. He opened the rear door. Empty. But on the seat was a photograph. It showed the two of us standing beside the vehicle. The photograph had been taken from inside the back seat. We were both visible. The date was August 21st, 2026. The officer turned the photograph over. There was one sentence. "One of you is already gone." He looked at me, then at himself. For the first time, I noticed something. His shadow was facing the wrong direction. The sun was rising in front of us. Our shadows should have stretched behind us. Mine did. His didn't. His shadow stretched toward me. The officer looked down. He saw it too. He stepped backward. The shadow moved forward. He raised his gun. "Run!" I ran. I don't remember how far. I don't remember where I went. I only remember the sound behind me. 3 footsteps. Then silence. 3 more. The same rhythm. The same distance. 20 yards. Always 20 yards. And somewhere behind me, the officer screamed. I never saw him again. His vehicle was found abandoned later that morning. The official report listed him as missing. No body, no explanation. I became the subject of another search. This time, I didn't wait to be found. I went underground. Not literally. I mean, I disappeared. I stopped using my phone. I changed my name. I left my house. I moved between places. And for almost 6 months, the footsteps stopped. I thought I had escaped. Then one morning, while staying in a motel in Nevada, I opened the curtains. Across the parking lot was a man in an orange jacket. He was standing beside a vending machine. I watched him for several seconds. He looked at me, then smiled. I closed the curtains. When I looked again, he was gone. I packed my things. I left the motel. I drove for 6 hours. That evening, I stopped at a rest area. There was a man sitting at a picnic table, orange jacket. I kept driving. 20 miles later, I stopped again. Another rest area. Another man, orange jacket. I realized then that distance didn't matter. It wasn't following me through roads. It was following me through something else. Memory, recognition, maybe fear, maybe all three. And that's when I remembered the sentence from the old sheriff's report. Do not allow returned subjects to view photographs of themselves. I had spent years looking at photographs of Daniel, photographs of myself, photographs of the figure. Maybe that was the mistake. Maybe every time I looked, I was giving it another way to recognize me, another way to become me. I stopped looking at photographs. I stopped looking into mirrors. I stopped using reflective windows whenever possible. For a while, it worked. Then, I discovered something worse. My reflection had started appearing where I wasn't. A security camera at a gas station, a store window, a dark television screen. Always behind me, always wearing orange, always smiling. I stopped sleeping. I stopped trusting my own memories. Eventually, I returned to Montana. Not because I wanted to, because I realized there was nowhere else to go. The pattern always led back. Granite Creek, the abandoned station, the ravine, the tunnel, the place where Daniel had disappeared. I went there alone. I carried no weapon, no radio, no camera, only a paper map. The trail was different than I remembered. Trees had fallen. The old path had narrowed. But I recognized the ridge. I reached the ravine just before sunset. There was a man standing across the creek. Orange jacket. Daniel's face. He looked at me. Then he said, "You finally came back." I didn't answer. He smiled. "You were always going to. Who are you?" He tilted his head. "You know." "No." "Yes." He stepped closer. I didn't move. He said, "You were there the first time." "What first time?" "The first search." "I wasn't. You were. I saw you." He smiled again. "You saw yourself." Then I understood. Or thought I did. The photographs weren't showing the future. They weren't showing different people. They were showing the same person at different points in the cycle. The person who disappeared. The person who returned. The person who followed. All of them were connected. Maybe they were the same identity moving through different people. Maybe the forest didn't create copies. Maybe it erased distinctions. The man across the creek stepped into the water. He came toward me. I stayed still. He stopped approximately 20 feet away. Exactly 20 feet. Then he said, "It's your turn," I asked. "Turn for what?" He pointed behind me. I didn't want to look. I did anyway. There was another man standing on the trail, orange jacket, my face. He looked exactly like me. He raised his hand. The man across the creek smiled. Then the other version of me said, "Keep walking." The man across the creek disappeared. I turned back. The creek was empty. No footprints, no movement, nothing. I was alone. Except for the man on the trail, he was still there. My face, my clothes, my posture. He looked tired. He looked frightened. And suddenly, I understood why Daniel had never been able to describe the person following him. Because the face wasn't stable. It changed depending on who was looking. To Daniel, it looked like Daniel. To me, it looked like me. To Paul, it had probably looked like Paul. The thing wasn't copying people. It was showing them what they were afraid to see. I stepped toward my double. He stepped backward. For the first time, I realized something. He wasn't following me. He was waiting for me. And behind him, deeper in the trees, I heard footsteps. 3. Then 3 more. Then another 3. Multiple sets, coming closer. I looked at the man wearing my face. He whispered, "You're not the missing one." I asked, "Then who is?" He smiled. "You are." The forest went silent. Then every tree seemed to move at once. Branches, leaves, footsteps, voices, dozens of voices. Some were Daniel's, some were Paul's, some were mine, all saying the same thing. "Keep walking." I closed my eyes and walked. I don't know how long. I don't know where. When I opened my eyes, I was standing beside the old forestry station. The concrete foundation was intact. The tunnel entrance was open, and someone had left a flashlight on the ground. It was still warm. I picked it up. Inside the tunnel, the walls were covered with names, but there was one new name, mine, not written in pencil, not scratched, carved deeply into the concrete. Ethan Cole. Underneath it, returned. I stood there for a long time. Then I heard footsteps behind me. 3. I didn't turn. The voice behind me whispered, "Welcome home." And this time, I knew exactly who had said it. It was Daniel. But when I finally looked back, there was nobody there. Only my own footprints, leading into the tunnel, and another set coming out.